There's something different about the backroads of Texas. If you've ever driven them at night, you know what I mean. Miles of dirt, no lights, no houses, just the hum of your engine and that uneasy feeling that something out there is watching. This video is called 20 True Halloween Night Horror Stories from Texas. These are real accounts from people who've experienced terrifying things along those endless stretches of highway. Things they still can't explain. From silent figures walking bridges at 2 a.m. to strangers who vanish into the desert without a sound. These stories remind us that sometimes the scariest places aren't haunted houses. They're the roads we drive every day. You're watching Creepy Vibes, where every story is based on real events and every detail drags you a little deeper into the dark side of reality. Before we start, here's something crazy. Almost 90% of the people who watch these videos never subscribe. I'm trying to reach 6,000 subscribers this month, and you can help make that happen. So if you love true horror stories and want more of them every night, hit that subscribe button, turn off the lights, and get comfortable. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Now let's head down those dark Texas back roads and see who never made it back. The night they drove out to the desert, the air was as still as a photograph. West Texas had that kind of silence that made you think twice about your own heartbeat. And when you stopped talking long enough, you could swear you heard the earth breathing. Marfa was a quiet town back then. Nothing much except a few lights, a few drifters, and a legend that refused to die. They called them the Marfa Lights. Strange orbs that danced across the desert horizon, hovering like restless spirits. No one knew what they were. Some said swamp gas, others said UFOs, but the locals, especially the old ranchers, didn't like to talk about them after dark. The four of them were college students from Lubbock, full of that particular brand of arrogance that comes from being young and sure the world is a puzzle you can solve with enough caffeine and camera film. There was Michael, the ringleader with his boxy camcorder and his Ford Bronco. His girlfriend Lisa, who didn't believe in ghosts but kept a cross in her pocket anyway. Danny, who laughed at everything but carried a revolver he swore was just for snakes. And Paul, quiet and strange, the kind of boy who took notes even when no one asked him to. He said he'd seen the lights once as a kid and never forgot the way they moved like they were alive. They reached the viewing area around 9, a flat stretch of land where the highway cut through scrub and mesquite. The sun had gone down behind the Chinati Mountains, leaving a thin red line like a wound on the horizon. The air smelled of dust and old engine oil. Michael set up his tripod, checking the batteries twice while Lisa unrolled their sleeping bags. Danny built a small fire from driftwood, and Paul stood at the edge of the dark, staring out toward where the desert met the sky. "You'll see them soon," he said quietly. "They always come after the world goes still." Michael laughed, adjusting the focus on the camera. "If we catch anything, I'll sell it to Channel 8, maybe get us on TV." But an hour passed, then another, and nothing came. Just the wind sighing through the sagebrush and the faint hum of far-off power lines. The others started to grow restless. Lisa dozed against Michael's shoulder while Danny tossed beer cans into the fire. Paul didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the darkness as if he were waiting for something specific. Then, just past midnight, he whispered, "There." At first, it was only one light, a pale blue shimmer hovering above the desert floor miles away. It pulsed gently like a heartbeat, then split into 2, then 3, each one drifting and weaving through the air. The others sat up quickly. Michael grabbed the camera, muttering to himself as he adjusted the lens. The camcorder whirred softly, capturing the impossible dance. The lights didn't move like aircraft. They curved and twisted, sometimes merging into one, then separating again. A cold wind stirred the sand, carrying with it a low sound that didn't belong to the earth or sky. "What is that?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Paul didn't answer. He had stepped closer to the edge of the viewing area, his breath visible in the cold night air. The lights began to shift color, from blue to white, then to a deep, sickly yellow that made the desert look bruised. The sound grew louder, a droning hum that made their teeth ache. Michael zoomed in, swearing quietly as the image flickered. On the screen, the lights seemed to be changing shape, stretching into something vaguely human. "Faces," Lisa said suddenly. "I see faces." Michael started to say something, but the words died in his throat. The shapes on the screen weren't just tricks of light. They were faces, hundreds of them moving and twisting as if trapped behind glass. Some were screaming, mouths wide but silent, others expressionless, eyes glowing like coals. The hum turned into a whispering chorus, voices that weren't quite words but close enough to make the skin crawl. Danny dropped his beer and reached for the revolver. "Turn it off," he said. "Mike, turn that thing off now." But Michael couldn't. The camera wouldn't stop recording even when he pressed the button. The viewfinder flickered violently, showing the desert, then the lights, then something else. A dark outline standing between them and the horizon. It was tall, too tall to be human, and its head was tilted like it was studying them. The voices stopped. The only sound was the wind scraping across the sand. Lisa screamed first when she saw it move. The figure didn't walk or run. It simply appeared closer, like skipping through space. 1 second it was far away. The next it was 20 feet from them, shimmering in the pale light. Its body looked thin and stretched, as if it had been pulled out of shape by something cruel. Michael dropped the camera, the lens cracking as it hit the ground, but the red light stayed on, recording. Danny fired the revolver. The shot echoed through the desert, but the figure didn't react. Instead, the lights behind it flared, burning white-hot. Paul took a step forward, his eyes wide, and said softly, "They remember me." Before anyone could stop him, he walked straight toward the figure. The wind rose into a howl, and for a moment the world seemed to bend. The others watched as Paul vanished into the brightness, swallowed by it. The lights blinked out. The wind died. The desert went back to silence. They searched for him until dawn. When the sun came up, all that was left were their tire tracks and the cold remains of the fire. Michael's camera was missing, though the cracked lens cap lay in the dust. They drove back to town in silence, unable to speak about what had happened. The sheriff said it was probably heat stroke or drunken wandering. The desert took people sometimes, he said, and didn't give them back. 2 days later, a rancher found the camera 10 miles north, half buried in sand. The tape inside was still running when he picked it up, the motor humming weakly. He turned it over, curious, and swore he heard something whisper from inside. The tape was handed to the authorities, but when they played it back, most of it was static. Only at the end did a voice emerge, faint but unmistakable. It was Paul, whispering his own name over and over, as if trying to remind himself he still existed. And underneath that voice, almost lost in the background, came the sound of wind moving through the desert. Soft, steady, and whispering the same name back. In Marfa, folks still drive out there on Halloween night, hoping to catch the lights on camera. Most don't see anything, just a few flickers of heat on the horizon, but every now and then, someone swears they hear a voice when the wind changes direction. They say it sounds like a man calling out from far away, his words stretched thin by distance. If you listen closely, it almost sounds like he's asking for help. In the fall of 1967, the town of Denton County had the kind of damp chill that got into your bones and stayed there. The cotton fields were nearly empty by late October, the air heavy with the sweet rot of fallen pecans and the faint copper tang of river mud. Folks around there didn't talk much about the goat man anymore, at least not in daylight. Not since the night they hung him under the old Alton Bridge. But some stories dig their claws deep into the soil, and even when everyone pretends to forget, the land doesn't. It remembers. Oscar Washburn was his name, though most white folks called him the Goat Man. He lived out near the bridge with his wife and 2 children, raising goats for milk, meat, and hides. People whispered that his goats had eyes like glass marbles and that he used their blood in charms. Others said he could call storms, that he'd cursed a sheriff's deputy who later hanged himself in his own barn. But anyone who ever met Oscar in daylight said the man was soft-spoken, patient, and stubborn in a quiet way that made certain men feel small. He sold his cheese and soap door to door, even to the wives of the same men who spat near his boots when he passed through town. It was one of those men, a drunk named Harris, who started the talk about witchcraft. One night, Harris claimed he saw Oscar leading a black goat across the bridge at midnight, muttering prayers to the devil. By morning, Harris had half the town convinced the goatman had cursed his cattle to die. When the cows turned up dead 2 days later, bellies split open and eyes gone white, Harris and 6 others drove out with ropes and torches. The sheriff didn't stop them. Nobody did. They dragged Oscar from his house, his wife screaming behind him. They beat him bloody and tied a noose around his neck right there under the bridge, the goats bleeding from the pen, sounding almost human in their cries. They pushed him off the edge, but when they looked down, the rope hung empty, swinging like a pendulum over the black water. They searched all night but never found a body. Some said he slipped the noose and crawled away. Some said the devil took him home. A week later, Harris's barn burned to the ground. Then the next man's fields withered. One by one, the mob broke apart. Accidents, suicides, sickness that doctors couldn't name. The bridge was abandoned not long after, its boards rotting, its iron frame bleeding rust into the river. By the 1980s, it was just another ghost story kids told to scare each other on Halloween. They said if you parked your car on the bridge at night and called out, "Goat man," 3 times, you'd hear the sound of hooves behind you. That was the story that caught the attention of a man named Dale Harper, a self-styled ghost hunter from Dallas who ran a small YouTube channel called Texas Haunts. He was the kind of man who loved the sound of his own voice and believed he was destined for fame. In October of 2019, he decided to spend Halloween night at Goatman's Bridge live streaming to his followers. The video is still online, though no one can agree on what they actually saw before it went dark. The stream began around 10:45 p.m. Dale was wearing his trademark camo jacket and a headlamp that threw a harsh white beam into the woods. The chat was full of laughing emojis and dares.
"Say his name," they wrote.
"Do the chant." Dale grinned, a toothpick in his mouth, his voice echoing in the damp air. "All right, folks, we're here at Old Alton Bridge. Legend says this is where the Goatman himself was lynched by a racist mob back in '67. Tonight, we're gonna find out if he's still hanging around." Behind him, the bridge stretched out like a skeleton, the metal frame groaning with the wind. He walked halfway across and turned his camera toward the creek below, black water moving slow beneath. "It's colder here," he said, rubbing his arms. "You feel that? Like something breathing on you." He pulled out a small EMF reader, the kind you buy off Amazon. The lights flickered red. His chat went wild. "All right, Goatman," Dale said, his voice trembling only a little. "I'm calling you out, buddy. If you're here, make yourself known." He paused, then laughed nervously. "Goatman, Goatman, Goatman." The last word hung in the air like smoke. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the goats began to bleat. At first it was faint, almost like wind through the trees. Then it grew louder, closer, echoing under the bridge, though there hadn't been a farm there in 50 years. Dale's light flickered. "You hear that?" he whispered. The camera jostled as he turned toward the sound. The beam caught something moving in the shadows, just a shape, hunched and shivering. "Probably a deer," he muttered, his breath quickening. But the thing stepped forward, and it wasn't a deer. The viewers saw it before he did, flooding the chat with messages. "Behind you. Dude, run. WTF is that?" The creature was tall, with legs too long and a face like melting wax, the suggestion of horns glinting at the edges of the light. Its eyes were deep pits, blacker than the night around it. It stood still, except for a slow, steady twitch of its head like a goat testing the air. Dale took a step back, the bridge creaking beneath him. "All right, I don't know who's out here, but this ain't funny," he said. His voice cracked. "You hear me?" The camera shook as he fumbled for his flashlight. When the beam came back on, the figure was gone. Only the sound of breathing remained, wet, heavy, right behind him. "Stop," he said, spinning around. The camera caught his face for an instant, his eyes wide and glassy. Then his skin began to ripple like wax under a flame. It sagged from his cheekbones, sliding down his neck in thick, glistening folds. His mouth opened, but the scream came out as a bleat. The viewers thought it was a trick at first, some kind of special effect. But then his camera fell, hitting the wood with a hollow thud. It rolled sideways, catching the underside of the bridge. In the flickering light, they saw hooves, split and black, scraping against the boards. The sound was sharp, deliberate, like someone pacing in anger. The stream continued for almost 10 minutes after Dale went silent. The camera's angle showed only the river below, faint ripples spreading outward as something heavy dropped into the water. Then came the whisper, faint but clear, threading through the static. "Still here." Police found his car parked by the trail the next morning, keys still in the ignition. His phone and camera were recovered from the creek. The casing warped from heat, though there'd been no fire. The footage matched the live stream exactly, down to the final whisper. Dale Harper was never found. Locals say the bridge feels different now. Colder. The rust tastes sharper in the air, and sometimes when the wind hits just right, you can hear bleeding under the boards. Those who dare to cross after dark say they smell wet fur and burned rope. A few claimed to have seen a man standing by the riverbank, his skin peeling away like candle wax, his eyes shining like glass marbles. Every Halloween, someone new tries to film there, chasing fame, chasing ghosts. And every time, the town goes quiet for a while after, waiting to see if another name gets added to the list. The goatman never speaks above a whisper, but he doesn't need to. The bridge does it for him, groaning under the weight of all that history, all that hate. In Denton County, the past doesn't rest easy. It bleats in the dark, calling home anyone foolish enough to listen. It was the summer of 1996 when the heat in Abilene seemed to linger even after dark, pressing down on the town like a heavy hand. The cicadas never stopped, and the asphalt shimmered under the moonlight as if it were still midday. Russell Hartman, a 38-year-old journalist for the Abilene Reporter News, had spent 2 weeks chasing a story that most editors would have laughed off the desk. He'd heard the whispers at a truck stop outside of town, about children showing up on doorsteps, just before midnight, knocking softly, asking in polite, unnatural voices if they could come inside. He had driven all over Taylor County with his old Sony tape recorder, interviewing locals who looked like they hadn't slept in weeks. There was a woman on South 14th Street who swore she saw 2 kids standing on her porch one night, pale as chalk and wearing outdated clothes. She said their eyes were all wrong, too dark, too deep. She told Russell they didn't look evil exactly, but wrong, like something trying too hard to be human. Russell had written her off at first. Meth use had been crawling through the town then, and he figured she was one of the many it had sunk its teeth into. But her story wasn't unique. Over and over he heard the same words. They wanted to come inside. By the 3rd week, the story had gone from a curiosity to an obsession. His wife Lydia told him to drop it. She said he was scaring himself for nothing, that the so-called black-eyed kids were just an urban legend. But Russell couldn't shake the voices. The way people's faces went blank when they remembered the knocks. He'd started to dream about them too. 2 small shapes standing at his own front door, their heads tilted slightly upward, smiling faintly, saying, please. He'd filled 4 cassette tapes by then. On the night of July 22nd, he sat in his study replaying interviews. The air conditioner had died 2 days before and the house was stifling. Lydia had taken their daughter to her sister's place to escape the heat. Russell sat alone with a glass of whiskey sweating on the table beside him. He rewound the tape and listened to his own voice, calm and measured as he asked a ranch hand about what he'd seen. The man's reply came through the static. They don't blink. You ever see a kid not blink for 5 minutes? That's not right. They asked to use my phone. I said no. Then they just smiled and walked off into the dark. Russell jotted notes in the margin of his notepad. At some point past midnight, he noticed something strange on the recording. A faint sound after the man stopped talking, like a whisper layered beneath the hiss of the tape. He leaned closer, turned the volume up, and played it again. It was almost too faint to make out, but it sounded like breathing. He convinced himself it was interference. The old recorder had been acting up. He checked the clock, 12:43 a.m. He should have gone to bed, but instead he picked up the recorder and started speaking into it. This is Russell Hartman, Abilene, Texas. I'm compiling reports of unexplained visits by what locals are calling black-eyed children. Witnesses claim these kids appear between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., always asking to be let inside. They speak calmly, politely, but something about their eyes. He hesitated, looking at the red light blinking steadily on the recorder. If there's any truth to this, I want it on tape. A knock came at the door. 3 soft, deliberate knocks. He froze. The sound came again, same rhythm, same weight. He told himself it was probably a neighbor, maybe old Mrs. Callahan next door. She was always asking for help with her porch light. He set the recorder down, still running, and went to the front door. Through the beveled glass, he saw 2 small figures standing on the porch. A boy and a girl. Sir, the boy said, his voice muffled through the door. We're lost. Can we come inside? Russell's throat went dry. The girl stood behind the boy, her face hidden in the shadow of her bangs. Something about the way they stood, perfectly still, hands folded in front of them, made him feel colder than the air should have allowed. He tried to sound calm. Where are your parents? They'll be here soon, the boy said. We just need to come inside and wait. Every instinct told Russell to open the door, but his legs refused to move. The porch light flickered once, casting a brief flash across their faces. Their skin was pale, nearly gray. When the light steadied again, he saw their eyes. No whites, no color, just solid black from lid to lid. Russell stumbled backward, heart hammering. "I can call the police for you," he said, voice shaking. The girl tilted her head. "That's not necessary. Please let us in." The boy smiled faintly, a small, unnatural curve of the mouth. "We can't come in unless you say yes." That sentence snapped him out of it. He slammed the deadbolt and stumbled back to his desk. The knocking began again, slow, polite, insistent. He sat there in the heat, staring at the door until it finally stopped. He didn't sleep. When dawn came, the front porch was empty. By the time Lydia came home the next evening, Russell was pale and shaking. He told her everything, played the tape for her. She rolled her eyes until she heard the part where the knocks began faintly in the background. "Probably some neighbor kids playing a prank," she said. But when they replayed the tape, there was more. After his voice trailed off, a whisper came, soft but distinct. "Please let us in." Russell stared at the recorder. "That wasn't there before," he said. Lydia told him to stop scaring himself, to throw the damn tapes away. He didn't. He left them on his desk, meaning to listen again later. 3 days passed. He went back to work, tried to file a different story, but the recorder kept pulling his attention. On Friday night, when the house was silent and the cicadas had quieted, he finally sat down and pressed play again. The tape began with his voice, the old interview, the knock. Then something new. After his last words, after he'd stopped speaking, a faint shuffle. Then a child's voice, clearer this time, right next to the microphone. "Thank you for letting us in, Mr. Hartman." Russell froze. The air seemed to vanish from the room. The next sound on the tape was a creak, wood bending under weight. Then another voice, the girl's, whispering, "It's so much cooler in here." He dropped the recorder. It clattered to the floor and kept playing, hissing softly, then falling silent. The house felt different. He turned toward the hallway where the air seemed to shift. From the darkness near the bedroom door, he saw two shapes, small, motionless, watching. Lydia found the tape 2 days later. The front door was locked from the inside. The car still in the driveway, the windows all shut tight. The recorder was sitting on the desk, still running, the tape spinning in the dead air. When she played it, she heard his last words, then the children's voices again. This time there was something else. A long pause, then the unmistakable sound of a man breathing close to the mic. Then faintly the boy's voice again, calm and steady. "He's with us now." The rest was static. No one ever saw Russell again. The police called it a disappearance. The house went up for sale a year later, though it took months to find a buyer. People said the porch light never stayed lit, no matter how often the bulb was changed. And sometimes, neighbors claimed, if you stood outside after midnight, you could hear knocking. 3 soft raps on the door, followed by a voice, polite and patient, asking to come inside. And somewhere deep in the heat of a Texas night, a tape recorder still whispers, waiting for someone to press play. The night the church burned, the sky over San Antonio turned the color of blood. It was Halloween of 1943, a night already thick with smoke from hearth fires and trick-or-treat bonfires. The air dry and restless with a coming storm that never broke. St. Bridget's stood on the edge of town, a Spanish colonial church built in the 1800s, its whitewashed walls and tall bell tower visible from nearly every street. Inside, candles flickered and the scent of incense drifted like ghosts between the pews. They were holding the All Hallows Eve Mass, an old tradition brought from the Mexican borderlands, a night to pray for the souls of the forgotten dead. Nobody knew who started the fire. Some said it began in the sacristy near the oil lamps. Others whispered it was the devil himself, come to claim the wayward. The first flames rose behind the altar, a soft orange glow that no one noticed until the smoke thickened and the choir coughed through their hymn. By the time the priest, Father Delaney, realized what was happening, the front doors had swollen shut from the heat. They tried the side exits, but the wood blistered and cracked before they could open them. People screamed. The fire rolled across the ceiling, devouring the rafters with a roaring hunger that drowned out prayer and music alike. Witnesses outside said the bell rang once, a deep and hollow toll that echoed across the empty streets. Then the tower itself caught, flames crawling up its spine like a living thing. By morning, all that was left of St. Bridget's was the stone foundation and the skeletal remains of the bell tower, standing alone in a field of ash. The city rebuilt around it. People moved on. The war overseas gave them new griefs to worry about, new names to carve into churchyard stones. By the next Halloween, the ruins were just another landmark on the southern edge of town, something kids dared each other to visit after dark. But that night, as the wind shifted and the moon rose pale and hollow over the hill, someone heard the bell ring. It was faint at first, a single low toll drifting across the rooftops, then another, and another. 13 in total, as though calling the faithful to midnight mass. But there was no bell left to ring. The iron had melted in the fire, warped and cracked beyond use. People tried to explain it away. Maybe it was a train in the distance or the echo of a cowbell on the wind. Still, the next morning, Father Miguel Alvarez, the young priest assigned to the new parish downtown, went to see for himself. He was 28, serious-eyed and newly ordained, determined to show the town that superstition had no place in faith. The ruins of St. Brigid's were quiet when he arrived. The bell tower leaned slightly to one side, its upper stones blackened, its stairs hidden in the shadows of the interior. The ground still smelled faintly of burnt wood even after a year. Miguel said a short prayer at the base, then began to climb. The wooden steps groaned under his weight, dust drifting from the beams above. He counted the turns as he ascended. 1, 2, 3, until the daylight narrowed to a single slit through the tower's side. Halfway up, he thought he heard something breathing. It was soft, rhythmic, and human. He paused, listening. The sound came again, a whisper of air, as if someone were kneeling in the dark just ahead. "Who's there?" he called, his voice echoing off the walls. Silence answered, then faintly the sound of shuffling feet. He climbed faster. The higher he went, the colder it grew, until the air felt damp and heavy like the inside of a crypt. The stone walls seemed to sweat. When he reached the landing, he saw the bell, whole and gleaming as if it had never been touched by flame. It hung perfectly still, though he could hear the echo of its toll still humming in the air. The rope dangled from the beam, frayed and blackened at the end, but moving gently as though someone had just let go. And then he saw them. They were kneeling in rows, facing the blackened altar that had once stood at the tower's base. Men, women, children, their clothes fused to their skin, hands clasped in prayer. Their faces were burnt away, but their bodies were intact, frozen in postures of devotion. A thin veil of ash covered them like dust on old statues. The nearest figure still held a rosary. The beads melted into its palm. Father Miguel felt his throat close as he stepped backward. The air smelled of something sweet and rancid, a mixture of incense and rot. He crossed himself and whispered a prayer for the dead, but the words fell flat in his mouth. One of the bodies moved. He froze. It was a small woman near the front, her head bowed low. The faintest motion of breath lifted her shoulders. "Señora," he said, his voice cracking. Her head turned, slow and stiff, and the sound of her neck moving was like the creak of dry leather. Beneath the soot, her eyes glowed faintly red. Around her, others began to stir, their prayers resuming in a low, rasping murmur. Latin words, half-burned and half-remembered, filled the air. Miguel stumbled backward toward the stairs, but the steps behind him had vanished into shadow. The bell above gave a single deep toll. The vibration shook the stones. The figures turned as one toward him. Their voices grew louder, weaving together in a desperate chant. "Domini salvum fac populum tum." Lord, save your people. The floor beneath his feet began to glow, faintly at first, then brighter. The ashes outlining the shape of the church as it had once been. The walls rose up in phantom light, pews, stained glass, the flickering candles all returning as shadows. Miguel fell to his knees. He could hear the crackle of fire again, smell the burning oil, the screams. The congregation was reliving it, praying through their own destruction. When the flames reached them again, they did not run. They simply bowed their heads and prayed harder. He understood then what he was seeing. They had never left. Their prayers had been answered, not by God, but by something that kept them here, trapped in their final devotion, their faith twisted into a loop of eternal penance. He covered his ears, but the sound filled his skull, the bell hammering inside his head until he thought it would split him open. The next morning, the parishioners found him at the base of the tower, eyes open, mouth black with soot. The doctors said he had fallen from the stairs, though his body showed no broken bones. Only his fingertips were charred, as if he had clung to something burning before he died. After that night, no one ever went near St. Bridget's again. They fenced it off, let the weeds swallow the stones. But every Halloween, when the air turns dry and the moon climbs high over San Antonio, the bell still tolls 13 times. Those who live nearby swear they hear the faint sound of prayer drifting down from the tower, a congregation still kneeling, still faithful, still burning in silence. The night had turned cool and empty over Highway 281, the kind of Texas highway where the road hums like a warning under your tires and the stars feel too far away to care. It was 1975, between Blanco and Johnson City, that long stretch of asphalt where the live oaks grow crooked and the road signs look like they've been there since the war. Truckers ran the line late into the night, chasing deliveries, coffee, and the sound of their own engines. That's when they started talking about her, the girl in the white dress. She always showed up the same way. Somewhere near mile marker 138, walking along the shoulder barefoot, her white dress catching the glow of headlights like a lantern. The story said she was maybe 20, pretty, polite, soft-spoken. Said she smelled faintly of lilac and smoke. She never looked dirty, but she was always alone. Truckers would pull over, back when men still thought stopping for a lone girl was the decent thing to do. And she'd climb in quietly, thank them, and give a name no one ever seemed to remember once they reached mile marker 142. That's where she disappeared. Some said she faded. Others swore she was just there 1 second and gone the next, like she'd stepped out into the air. They all told the same story, and no one ever found any trace of her afterward. Ray Dempsey had heard the stories long before he saw her. He was new to the long haul, a big man from Houston with a mustache thick enough to catch dust and a voice like gravel. He'd signed on with Hill Country Freight, running night shifts to San Antonio and back. He thought the other drivers were full of it. Ghost stories were for diners and drunks. That changed on the first week of October, when the rain finally stopped and the air turned sharp enough to make him roll his window up halfway. He was heading south from Marble Falls, rig full of grain feed, the radio catching a country station out of Austin that kept cutting in and out. He was half an hour out from Blanco when he saw her. The headlights caught the white dress first. She was walking along the shoulder, long brown hair hanging in wet strands, barefoot like she didn't feel the gravel. She turned her head as he slowed, her eyes catching the light like mirrors. Ray hesitated, then pulled over. She didn't say much when she climbed in. Her hands were small, clasped in her lap, and her voice was soft when she said thank you. He noticed she was shivering, so he turned up the heat and asked where she was headed. Just south, she said, past Johnson City. He told her he could take her that far. She smiled, in a quick, distant kind of smile, and looked out the window. They drove in silence for a few miles. The rain had stopped, but the highway was still slick. He tried to make conversation, talking about his route, about how the gas prices were creeping up again. She didn't say much, only that she used to live near there, out by the river road, said her daddy had a farm. He asked her name, but the wind caught her voice when she answered, and all he heard was something like Lena or Lena. The longer they drove, the more Ray noticed something odd. She didn't move much, just stared straight ahead. And her dress, though clean, looked old-fashioned, like something out of the 1950s. The fabric had that stiff cotton sheen, and the ribbon around her waist was torn. There was also a faint smell in the cab now. Not perfume, not lilac, but something harsher. Gasoline, maybe mixed with metal. They passed the sign for mile marker 141. Ray asked again where she needed to go, but she didn't answer. She just lifted her hand and pointed straight ahead. Her nails were short, clean, and her skin pale as milk. That's when he saw the dark spot on her dress. It started at her stomach, small at first, then spreading slow and wet, a deep brownish red. He stared, blinking, not sure if the lights from the dashboard were tricking him. "Hey," he said. "You hurt yourself?" She didn't turn her head. "Miss?" When the marker for 142 came up, the smell of gasoline got stronger, thick enough that it burned his throat. He looked down and saw it, and the seatbelt. It wasn't fastened, but it was stained dark, and it looked old, like the fabric had been soaked and dried 100 times. When he glanced back up, the passenger seat was empty. He slammed the brakes so hard the rig fishtailed. The tires screamed against the wet road, the trailer lurching behind him. He sat there breathing hard, staring at the seat where she'd been just seconds before. The door was still shut. The window was still rolled up. He climbed out, flashlight shaking in his hand. The air outside was cold and quiet except for the ticking of the engine. He swept the beam over the road, nothing but asphalt and darkness. The marker sign gleamed faintly ahead. 142. He thought about the stories then, the ones he'd laughed off. About the wreck that had happened near that very stretch 20 years earlier. A pickup that went up in flames after a head-on collision. The driver had died instantly. The passenger, a young woman in a white dress on her way to her wedding, had crawled out, clothes soaked in gas, burned alive before help arrived. They said she'd been buried up in Blanco, but folks still saw her walking the road when the nights turned cold. Ray climbed back in the truck. The seat was damp, not wet enough to drip, but damp with something that smelled faintly of gasoline and rust. He wiped his hand on his jeans and started the engine. He didn't look at the passenger seat again until he reached the diner outside Johnson City. The lights from the sign flickered red and white across the hood. He parked, breathing steady now, telling himself it was nerves, a trick of the rain and the dark. Inside, the waitress poured him coffee without asking. She was a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a silver ring on her finger. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, half smiling. Ray didn't answer right away. Then he asked, "You ever hear about a girl on 281 wears white, looks like she's walking home?" The waitress's face changed. "You mean the hitchhiker?" she said quietly. "You picked her up, didn't you?" He nodded once. She set down the coffee pot, leaned on the counter. "Happens every few years," she said. "Always around fall. My brother saw her once, back in '66. He said she was bleeding from the stomach like she'd been stabbed or burned. Disappeared right around the same mile you're talking about." Ray didn't say anything else. He finished his coffee, left $1, and walked back out into the cold. When he climbed into the cab, the smell hit him again, sharp and oily like gasoline soaked into old fabric. He rolled down the window, trying to let it out, and that's when he saw the seatbelt. It was fastened now, tight. The buckle glinted under the dashlight, and for a moment he swore he saw a thin red stain beneath it, like blood dried into the weave. He reached for it, fingers shaking, and as soon as he touched the fabric, it felt warm. Ray drove through the rest of the night without stopping. He didn't pick up another hitchhiker again. A week later, another driver on the same route swore he saw her too. White dress, no shoes, walking near mile marker 138. He didn't stop, but he said when he passed her, she turned her head toward his truck, and her eyes glowed red in the reflection of the taillights, like coals still burning after everything else had gone dark. They say she still walks that stretch of 281 when the nights are long and the air smells like rain and gasoline. The drivers don't stop anymore, but they keep the stories alive. About the girl who never made it home, the seatbelt that won't stay clean, and the road that hums a little louder when you pass mile marker 142, as if the earth itself is remembering her scream. In the summer of 1922, the hill country baked like a kiln. The creeks between Wimberley and Blanco had been dry for nearly 8 months, and the Guadalupe River was nothing more than a cracked scar through the limestone. Men prayed under church rafters that smelled of sweat and candle wax. Women left jars of milk at crossroads for saints that no longer listened, and the cattle stumbled through dust, their ribs showing like fence rails. The locals called that long stretch of drought the Devil's Thirst, and they said the only thing deeper than the dry wells was the silence that came after sundown, the canyon that lay between the two. Towns was called the Devil's Backbone, a twisted ridge of limestone and cedar that curved like a spine above the scrubland. It was a place ranchers avoided at night, though no one could quite say why. Some claimed to have seen lights flickering in the ravine. Others swore they heard voices in the wind, old words not meant for men to speak. But in August of that year, when the last windmill went still and the cattle began to rot where they fell, a stranger came riding through the canyon. He was tall, his hat black as tar, his coat heavy even in the heat. He rode a gray horse that didn't seem to sweat. When he came into Wimberley, he didn't speak much, just asked who owned the land near the backbone. The men at the feed store told him that was old Jedediah Crane's spread, though Jedediah wasn't much for company since his wife and 2 sons had gone out west in search of rain and hadn't come back. The stranger nodded and rode on without saying thank you. That night, lightning flickered behind the hills, but there was no thunder, no rain. The next morning, a few ranchers spotted the stranger at Crane's place, standing near the well with his hat off, talking to Jedediah. By sundown, the wind picked up from the east, and by morning it rained for the first time in almost a year. A slow, steady rain that turned the dust to mud filled the gullies and sent laughter ringing through the town. The cattle drank until their bellies swelled, and the fields, bare for months, sprouted green within a week. Nobody asked too many questions. Folks said the old man must have struck some luck, found a spring under the rock maybe. But there was talk too, low and nervous, about the man in the black hat. He wasn't seen again, not by anyone sober. But the Crane place changed. The cattle grew fat, the grass thick and rich. Jedediah even bought new horses from Blanco, though no one could say where the money came from. Then come October, on the eve of All Hallows, Jedediah was gone. The house was empty, doors wide open, lamps still burning. No signs of struggle, no blood, just gone. The sheriff rode out, searched the canyon, found nothing but hoof prints leading toward the cliffs. They said the prints stopped at the edge, as though horse and rider had walked straight into the rock. The next year the rains came again, but so did the whispers. Another rancher, a man named Rusk, who'd bought up part of Crane's land, found a note tacked to his barn door one morning. It was written in a shaky hand. "The harvest comes due on the eve. Keep your gates locked and your prayers quiet." He burned it, thinking it a joke. But come Halloween night, his wife woke to the sound of cattle screaming. By the time he reached the pens, there was nothing but blood in the troughs and a stench so thick he couldn't breathe. The herd was gone. Every hoofprint led straight toward the backbone. By 1924, the pattern had become legend. Each Halloween, someone vanished. Sometimes a rancher, sometimes an entire family. Always the same. No struggle, no trail, no return. The land, though, thrived. The grass greener each spring, the herds fatter, the harvests richer. The more the canyon took, the more it gave back. Some said the earth was being fed. Others whispered that the stranger had made a deal, one that needed payment each year. The sheriff stopped investigating after the third family disappeared. Folks who asked too many questions didn't last long anyway. One man, a preacher from Austin, came to preach fire and redemption. He stood in the square shouting that the town had sold its soul to the devil. That night his horse came back riderless, and in the morning they found his Bible torn in half at the foot of the backbone. It was the autumn of 1926, when Thomas Vance came to Wimberley with his wife and 2 daughters. He bought the old Rusk place cheap, said he didn't believe in hillbilly ghost tales. He was a practical man, a veteran from the Great War, more comfortable with bullets than with Bibles. He laughed at the talk of curses and devils, told the locals that fear was for the ignorant. But that fall was the driest in a decade. The grass turned brittle, the well sank low, and the cattle bawled for water. Then one evening, while mending fence near the canyon, he saw him, the man in the black hat. He stood by the cedar break watching. Didn't move, didn't speak, just tipped his hat and walked back into the mist rising off the limestone. Vance followed for a while, thinking maybe it was a drifter or a thief. But when he reached the ridge, there were no tracks. Only the smell of rain in the air. That night, thunder rolled over the hills, and by morning it poured. The drought broke. Vance laughed, said the hill country was finally getting its due. He didn't notice the dead calf at the fence line, its eyes white and its mouth full of mud. As Halloween neared, his wife grew uneasy. She said she'd heard voices near the well, whispers that rose with the wind. The girls stopped playing outside, claimed someone was calling their names from the canyon. Vance told them it was nonsense, just coyotes and nerves. But on October 31st, he woke to find the gate open and the cattle gone. He saddled his horse, followed the trail into the backbone. He was gone by sunset. 2 days later, a group of ranchers found the horse grazing near the cliffs, its saddle soaked with something dark that wasn't rain. The limestone there had split open, a fresh crack running 50 feet across. From deep within, they said they heard a low hum like wind through a hollow pipe. Some said it was the devil breathing, others said it was the earth drinking its dew. After that, the town learned to live with it. Every year they left offerings, milk, bread, sometimes even livestock near the canyon's edge before Halloween. And in return, the land stayed kind. The rains came steady, the crops full. Nobody spoke of the stranger anymore, though some said he still walked the ridge when the moon was thin, hat low, coat dragging through the dust. They said if you followed him, you'd never come back. But the grass would grow greener where your boots had last touched the ground. In 1937, a survey crew came through to map the highway that would later cut through the backbone. They found bones buried deep in the limestone, hundreds of them, some human, some not. The paper said it was an ancient burial ground, that the old stories were superstition. But those who knew the land didn't believe it. They said the ground remembers what it's fed, and every Halloween, when the wind turns cold and the cedar whispers like voices, the people of Wimberley still leave something by the cliffs, not out of faith, not even out of fear, but because the rain still comes when it's needed, and because somewhere in that limestone something still hungers. They call it the harvest at Devil's Backbone, and they say it never ends. The Yorktown Memorial Hospital had been abandoned for over 20 years when the team pulled up that October night, their van headlights cutting through the weeds that had overrun the parking lot. The building rose out of the dark like something half asleep but aware of being watched. Its brick walls were cracked and flaking, its windows black voids that glinted faintly with shards of glass. The only sound was the wind rattling the rusted metal letters above the entrance, spelling out Yorktown Memo, half the name already gone to time. The team was 4 people. Jenna, the lead investigator, had been doing this for almost a decade. She was calm, methodical, never one to scream or run at a noise. Her brother Michael handled the cameras and audio recorders. Dana was the tech specialist, a quiet woman with a fascination for electromagnetic fields. And Rob was the muscle, there mostly to carry gear and make the others feel safer. None of them spoke much as they walked toward the double doors. The air was heavy with the smell of rain and mildew. Inside, the air was colder. Their flashlights swept across peeling paint, faded crucifixes, and broken tiles that glistened with moisture. Yorktown Memorial had been run by the Felician Sisters once, a Catholic hospital built in the 1950s and closed abruptly in the 1980s after a series of mysterious patient deaths and a fire that gutted the surgical wing. Local kids called it haunted, of course. People said the nuns who worked there never left. Others swore they'd seen patients wandering the halls, clutching at wounds that should have killed them decades ago. Jenna didn't believe in ghosts, not really. She believed in data, in recordings, in electromagnetic fluctuations she could graph and explain. But there was something about Yorktown that made her uneasy from the moment she stepped through those doors. It wasn't just the decay. It was the way the silence seemed to hum as if the air itself was alive. They set up base in what had once been the main lobby. The crucifix still hung behind the reception desk, its Christ figure blackened with soot. Jenna checked the map she'd printed from old blueprints. The surgical ward was at the back of the building, down 2 hallways and through a heavy fire door. That was where the fire had started. That was where, according to local lore, the hospital's last patient had died on the table after the doctor performing her surgery went mad and carved open his own wrists. They started recording just before midnight. Cameras clicked on. The EMF meter flickered green. Dana checked the thermal camera and nodded. "Let's go." The first hallway smelled like mold and formaldehyde. Their lights caught rows of rusted gurneys, shattered IV stands, a wheelchair overturned and frozen mid-motion like whoever had been sitting in it had simply vanished. The further they went, the more oppressive the air became. Every breath felt like it dragged something invisible into their lungs. They reached the fire door, its metal warped and black. Rob pulled it open with a grunt. On the other side was the surgical ward. The operating tables were still there, though the ceiling tiles had collapsed and the walls were streaked with soot. Surgical lamps hung at odd angles, their bulbs shattered like blind eyes. But what caught everyone's attention immediately was the mirror. It stood against the far wall, nearly 7 feet tall, its frame stainless steel, polished despite the surrounding decay. It shouldn't have been there. It wasn't in the blueprints, and no one remembered moving it during cleanup years ago. Yet there it was, untouched by fire or time. Michael whistled softly. Creepy, but kind of beautiful. Jenna stepped closer. The surface was spotless, perfectly reflective. She could see all 4 of them behind her, their flashlights glowing like stars in the dimness. Something about it made her skin prickle. "Dana, can you get a reading on this?" Dana held up her EMF meter. It spiked immediately, the needle slamming into red. "There's energy coming off it," she murmured. "A lot?" Jenna leaned closer. For a moment she thought she saw movement in the reflection, a flicker of someone walking past behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. When she looked back, the reflection was different. The others were still visible, standing behind her, but the version of herself in the mirror was lying on the operating table. Her face was pale, her eyes open but unseeing. There was blood spreading across her shirt. She gasped and stepped back so quickly she nearly tripped. "Jenna, what is it?" Michael asked, raising his camera. She shook her head. "Nothing. Just a trick of the light." But it wasn't. When she looked again, her reflection was back to normal, standing upright. Still, the image of her own lifeless body burned into her mind. They continued setting up equipment, though Jenna couldn't focus. Every sound made her jump. The creak of metal, the faint hiss of wind through broken vents. After an hour, Rob announced he was going to take a smoke break outside. Dana stayed with the monitors while Michael followed Jenna deeper into the ward, filming as they went. They found old medical charts, brittle and water-stained. One listed a patient named Helen Rourke, age 29, deceased June 3, 1984. Cause of death, exsanguination during procedure. Under attending physician, the name was smudged out. In the margin, someone had written in shaky pen, "He said the mirror showed him." Michael frowned. "The mirror showed him what?" Before Jenna could answer, the lights on their cameras flickered. The temperature dropped so suddenly their breath turned to fog. From the direction of the operating room came a metallic clatter, like a tray falling. "Dana?" Jenna called into her radio. Static answered. They hurried back. The equipment in the room was all still there, but Dana was gone. Her chair was toppled, her EMF reader on the floor, needle twitching violently. "Dana!" Michael shouted. His voice echoed, swallowed by the corridors. Then they heard it, a faint hum, almost like someone singing from a distant room. It was a woman's voice, soft and broken, repeating the same few notes over and over. Jenna followed the sound down the hall, every step echoing off tile and metal. The melody drew her like a thread. When she turned the corner, she froze. Dana was standing in front of the mirror, staring at it. Her face was slack, eyes wide, tears running down her cheeks. The reflection showed something else entirely. Dana lying on the ground, her throat open, her hands twitching. "Dana, get away from it," Jenna whispered, but Dana didn't move. The air vibrated with a low hum, like the mirror itself was breathing. Then Dana's body jerked once and she collapsed. Blood spread across the tile just as it had in the reflection. Jenna screamed. Michael grabbed her arm, pulling her back toward the door. They ran, their flashlights shaking, beams cutting across graffiti and debris. They didn't stop until they reached the main hall, panting. "We need to get out," Michael said. They turned the corner and found themselves back in the surgical ward. The mirror waited for them, gleaming under the flicker of dying flashlights. Jenna's pulse hammered. They had run straight, she was sure of it. But the hallway had folded in on itself. Every direction now led back to the operating room. Michael tried another route, kicking open doors, shouting. But every corridor circled back. It was as if the building itself had sealed around them. "Jenna," he whispered finally, staring at the mirror. "It's showing something again." She turned. The reflection now showed both of them, Michael lying face down, a shadow standing over him with a scalpel glinting in its hand. The figure turned slightly and she saw her own face behind the mask. Michael stepped back, panic rising. That's not real. It can't be. But when the overhead lamp flickered to life for a single blinding second, Jenna saw something flash across the mirror's surface. A hand, pale and blood-stained, reaching out. Then Michael screamed. He hit the floor, clutching his throat, blood pulsing between his fingers. The scalpel lay beside him, slick and gleaming. Jenna didn't remember touching it, but it was warm in her palm when she realized she was holding it. She dropped it and stumbled back. The mirror's surface rippled like water. The reflection showed her standing alone, covered in blood, the surgical lamp burning above her. Behind her reflection, something else moved. A dozen shapes, pale faces, eyes hollow and patient. She turned, but the room was empty. She ran again, every hallway looping, every doorway leading back to that same room. Time dissolved. Her flashlight died. Somewhere far away, she could still hear that faint humming, the song looping endlessly. When she looked back one last time, the mirror no longer showed her face. It showed the operating table, and on it a woman in a blood-stained shirt, her body still and eyes open, waiting. Weeks later, when a county cleanup crew entered Yorktown Memorial to assess the damage from a storm, they found 3 cameras, all smashed, and one mirror standing in the surgical ward, perfectly clean. On the recording from Michael's camera, one of the few frames that survived, there was a reflection visible just before the feed cut out. A woman staring into the lens from inside the mirror, her mouth open as if she were trying to speak. The timestamp read October 12, 2003. No one ever found Jenna. The first child vanished on the morning of November 1st, 1903, from a small white farmhouse on the edge of Terrell, Texas. The boy's mother said he'd gone out to feed the chickens, still in his Halloween shirt, and never came back. When the sheriff's men searched the yard, they found a handful of candy wrappers by the front steps. Strange ones, too. The paper was black and white, hand-wrapped, tied with twine, and sticky with sugar. No one in town sold sweets like that. The local storekeeper swore he'd never seen them before. Within 2 weeks, 2 more children went missing. Each disappearance was the same. Candy wrappers left at the door or on a windowsill, always on mornings after a new moon. The town whispered about the candy lady, an old story brought from England, they said, about a woman who gave children poisoned sweets. The people of Terrell had never taken it seriously until then. A widow named Clara Crane lived on the outskirts in a sagging farmhouse surrounded by dying cotton fields. Her husband had died years earlier, and some said she'd gone a bit touched in the head after her little girl was killed in an accident. Others said it wasn't an accident at all. The sheriff rode out there once, asked her if she'd seen anything suspicious, and came back pale-faced and silent. He wouldn't talk about what he'd seen in her kitchen. By Christmas, the town of Terrell was hollow-eyed and frightened. Parents barred their doors, kept their children from going out even to church. The candy stopped appearing after January, and the people prayed the horror was over. But the children were never found, and the name Candy Lady stuck like a curse whispered between generations. 100 years later, in 2004, the story had become a local legend told to scare kids on Halloween. Most dismissed it as old superstition, something that happened in a town that didn't exist anymore. But Terrell was still there, just bigger, modern, with new homes and the same old shadows. Melissa Hart had moved there with her husband and their 6-year-old son, Mason, 3 months earlier. They lived in a renovated farmhouse, white with a green tin roof, on the west side of town near a cornfield that looked golden in the morning sun. Melissa worked remotely as an insurance agent, and her husband drove trucks, often gone for days. She liked the quiet, the isolation, until Halloween night. That evening had gone smoothly. Pumpkins on the porch, kids in costumes, laughter echoing down the road. Mason dressed as a pirate, and they'd come home with a full bucket of candy. By 10 o'clock, the porch light was off and the house settled into its creaking stillness. The next morning, Melissa went out to check the mail and found something odd. Inside the metal mailbox were 3 pieces of candy, each hand-wrapped in black and white paper tied with twine. The paper looked old, yellowed at the edges. She thought it must be a leftover decoration from one of the neighborhood kids until she looked closer. The first piece had a faint white powder dusted across it. Sugar, she thought, forming letters. It spelled Mason. Her stomach tightened. She turned over the other 2 pieces. One said Mommy, and the last said Soon. She stood there in the cold morning air, her breath visible, and felt something ancient move behind her ribs. She called her husband, who laughed it off. It's just a prank list, probably some neighborhood kid who heard the Candy Lady story. But she couldn't shake it. That night, she put the candies in a plastic bag and left it on the counter. Mason went to bed early. Around midnight, she woke to a sound, a faint crinkle like paper being unwrapped. She went into the kitchen. The bag was still there, sealed tight. Yet she could smell sugar in the air, thick and cloying like caramel melting on a stove. She turned on the light. A single ant crawled across the counter, then another, heading toward the bag. The next day, she drove to the post office to ask if anyone had delivered something strange. The clerk, a gray-haired woman with wide eyes, said, "No, ma'am, but we've heard about those candies before. Some houses got them last Halloween, too. Folks moved away soon after." When Melissa asked what she meant, the woman just shook her head and muttered, "Don't let your boy eat them." That night, she locked all the doors and windows. She even set her phone to record in the hallway. Around 2 a.m., she woke again to a soft tapping. It came from Mason's room. She crept down the hallway, her bare feet silent on the wood. The tapping stopped. She opened the door. Mason was asleep, his small hand curled under his cheek. She turned to leave and froze. On the windowsill, illuminated by the moonlight, sat 3 more candies wrapped in the same black and white paper. Her name was written on one in sugar. The others had Mason's and her husband's. She woke her husband at dawn and demanded they leave. He agreed, uneasy now, but before they could pack, Mason came into the kitchen holding something in his hand. It was another piece of candy, half unwrapped, sticky with melted sugar. "I found it on my pillow," he said. Melissa snatched it from him and threw it into the sink, running the water until the sugar dissolved and the paper tore apart. Beneath the wrapping was something small and sharp, a splinter of bone. That night, her husband stayed awake, sitting in the living room with his shotgun across his lap. Melissa lay in bed beside Mason, too afraid to close her eyes. Around 3, the floor creaked, heavy footsteps moving down the hallway. Her husband shouted, the gun went off, and then silence. Melissa ran out of the bedroom. The living room was empty. The front door hung open and her husband was gone. On the floor by the couch were 3 new candies, each labeled with their names, but this time the sugar letters were smeared with something dark. The police searched for 2 days, finding nothing except faint footprints near the cornfield and a trail of ants leading to the porch. The official report said her husband had likely fled or been taken by an intruder, but the officers couldn't explain the candy or the sugar writing. Melissa moved out within a week, taking Mason to stay with her sister in Dallas. She tried to forget, but even there, miles away, the past followed. One morning, Mason came running from the yard, his face pale. "Mommy," he whispered. "She left me a candy." Melissa went outside. On the porch step was a single sweet black and white tied with twine. Written across the sugar in neat, careful letters was her son's name. The neighbors heard screaming that night, but said by the time the police arrived, the house was quiet. The doors were locked from the inside, the lights still on, and the kitchen table covered in sugar. They never found Melissa or Mason. Years later, people who move into the house still talk about strange gifts left in their mailboxes every Halloween. Candies wrapped in old paper tied with twine, each one with a name spelled in sugar. And sometimes when the moon is thin and the night is still, they say you can hear the sound of a woman laughing softly by the porch, whispering to the children through the cracks in the wood, asking in a voice sweet as syrup, "Would you like some candy?" Huntsville Cemetery sat at the edge of the pine woods, a wind-swept patch of uneven earth that looked more like a forgotten field than a resting place. The prison lay half a mile down the road, its floodlights cutting through the fog like pale fingers. Every few weeks, another man from the death row wing ended up here, buried in one of the plain wooden boxes stacked under the old oak. No markers, no flowers, just numbers carved into small stones. By 1971, there were more than 300 of those stones, and the locals had stopped counting. Laura Hines knew that cemetery better than most girls her age should. Her father had been a guard at the Walls unit for 15 years, and when she was little, she used to sit in the passenger seat of his pickup while he made his rounds on the prison road. He'd tell her stories about the men who died in the electric chair, how some of them didn't scream, how others had begged for their mothers right up until the last jolt. She'd listen with wide eyes, fascinated and horrified, while the truck headlights cut across the gates that led to the burial ground. By the fall of '71, Laura was 17, wild in the way that bored Texas girls got wild. Huntsville was a small town even then, and Halloween was the only night you could feel something like freedom. Her friends, Danny Moore, Ruthie Keller, and Paul Wexler, were restless and half drunk by the time she suggested it. They were sitting behind the old Texaco, passing a bottle of Southern Comfort, when Laura pointed toward the prison road and said, "You know what'd be scary? Spending the night up by the graves." Danny laughed a little too loud. He was the kind of boy who needed to prove himself. "What, you mean the convict graves? Hell, they say you can still hear 'em moaning out there." "That's the point," Laura said, smiling. "Midnight in the cemetery. Whoever chickens out first buys beer for a month." Ruthie looked pale even in the dim light. "Your daddy'll kill us if he finds out." "He won't," Laura said. "He's on night shift at the East Tower. We'll be gone before he even knows." By 11, they'd parked Danny's Ford Fairlane by the fence line and climbed the rusted gate. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. A thin fog moved through the rows of unmarked graves, and somewhere far off a coyote called. They brought flashlights and blankets and a small transistor radio that barely picked up the local station. The wind hissed through the trees, carrying the faint hum of the prison's generators. They spread out a blanket near the oak, where the oldest stones leaned toward the earth like drunks. Laura traced her finger across one of them. Just a number, 1934, etched deep into the rock. She felt a small chill move through her. Danny turned on the radio, twisting the knob until a Hank Williams song crackled through the static. Ruthie hugged her knees. Paul tossed rocks into the dark. They were trying to act casual, but none of them wanted to admit how heavy the air felt. Around midnight, the radio fizzled out. Dead air. Danny smacked it a few times, but the only sound that came through was a low hiss like a whisper under the static. Then they heard it. At first it sounded like the wind through the pines, thin and drawn out, but then it shaped itself into something else. A voice, low and distant, murmuring from the direction of the graves. 42. They froze. Ruthie turned toward Laura. Did you hear that? Before Laura could answer, another whisper came clearer this time. 43. Paul laughed nervously. Probably just the radio picking up some trucker channel. But the air was too still. There were no headlights, no engines. The voices seemed to rise out of the ground itself, soft and rhythmic as if counting. 44. Danny swung the flashlight toward the rows of stones, the beam jerking over crooked markers and dead grass. Nothing moved. 45. Laura felt her stomach twist. The number sounded wrong, too deliberate. Her father had told her once that the prison started keeping records of executions again after the war, sometime around 1942. Each year since, a few more had gone to the chair. She swallowed hard, staring into the dark. 46. The voices were overlapping now, a dozen low murmurs blending into one another, each one counting, each one louder than before. Ruthie began to cry softly. Laura, I want to go. Please, let's go. Danny tried to sound brave. It's just the wind. Don't be stupid. But his hand shook when he reached for the flashlight. 47. Something moved at the edge of the light, a shadow between the graves, quick and thin, like someone crawling just beneath the mist. Danny swore and stumbled back. Laura's heart was pounding so loud she could barely hear. It's counting the years, she whispered. The years they died. The voices quickened, overlapping now like a chant. 48. 49. 50. Paul bolted for the fence. Screw this, I'm gone, he shouted, tripping over a marker. Danny followed him, dragging Ruthie by the arm. Laura hesitated, frozen. The whispers had reached 71, her year. Then silence. The fog pressed closer. The oak's branches creaked above her, and for a moment she thought she saw faces in the mist. Pale, burned faces, lips moving soundlessly. She backed away, tripping on a loose stone. When she hit the ground, something cold brushed her hand, like fingers made of damp clay. She screamed and ran, tearing through the fence until her jeans ripped. The others were already in the car, shouting for her. Danny slammed the gas and the Ford fishtailed onto the prison road, gravel spitting behind them. No one spoke on the way back to town. Ruthie kept sobbing quietly. Paul wouldn't stop shaking. Laura stared out the window, her breath fogging the glass. The radio, still hissing, crackled once and a faint voice drifted through. 72. They didn't talk about that night again. Not at school, not to anyone. But 2 weeks later, when the rain came heavy and the creeks flooded, they found Ruthie's body at the edge of the woods, half buried in mud. No sign of a struggle. No footprints except hers. Her mouth was open, packed with wet soil, and the coroner said it looked like she'd been trying to speak when she died. Laura stopped sleeping after that. Her father noticed, though she never told him why. He found her one night sitting on the porch steps, staring down the prison road. "What's out there, honey?" he asked. She shook her head. "They're still counting." He frowned. "Who is?" "The ones you buried." He didn't answer. Just looked at her for a long time before walking back inside. That winter he quit the prison. Moved them to Conroe, said Huntsville wasn't good for a girl's nerves. But even years later, Laura would wake in the middle of the night, hearing the soft murmur of numbers whispered through her window. And every Halloween, right at midnight, no matter where she was, the air around her would shift. The voices would begin again, slow and patient. 73, 74, 75. She would close her eyes and pray it stopped before it reached her year. Because in Huntsville, the dead didn't rest. They waited. And every time another number was whispered, another grave opened just wide enough to let one more soul in. The house sat at the end of Elm Creek Road where the pavement turned to dirt and the trees hung low like they were listening. It had been empty for years, but nobody in town seemed to remember when exactly it became that way. Some said the last owners had left in the middle of the night. Others said no one ever lived there to begin with. It was the kind of house that felt like it had always been waiting. In June of 1984, the Hargrove family moved in. Dale, the father, was a mechanic out of Waco, quiet and practical, the sort of man who didn't believe in much beyond what he could fix with a wrench. His wife, Linda, was softer, religious but not fanatical, the type to keep a Bible on the nightstand and a cross above the kitchen door. They had 2 kids, a boy named Evan who was 13 and already hated everything about Texas, and his little sister April, who was 7, and thought the fields behind the house were filled with fairies. They were just looking for a place away from the city, someplace cheaper, someplace quiet. Elm Creek Road offered both. The house looked normal enough from the outside, white siding with peeling paint, a porch that sagged a little in the middle, a wide front yard filled with weeds that looked like they'd grown from bones. It was when the sun went down that things started to feel wrong. The first night, Dale went around trying to find the fuse box. The lights had come on the moment they'd stepped through the door, even though he hadn't connected the power yet. He assumed the realtor had forgotten to mention that the lines were still active, but when he opened the fuse panel in the basement, there were no breakers, no wires leading into it, nothing but a hollow metal shell fixed to the wall. He stared at it for a long time before deciding it wasn't worth worrying about. The lights worked, and they had a lot of unpacking to do. That night the house glowed, not just from the bulbs inside, but from the walls themselves, as if something behind the plaster was shining through. The light was a dull yellow, the color of old teeth. It came through the cracks in the door frames, seeped out from under the floors, and lingered even when they turned the switches off. Dale figured there must be some kind of faulty wiring, maybe a leftover generator, but when he went outside he saw it from the yard. The entire house was lit up like a lantern in the dark, and he could see every window glowing against the black sky. Linda didn't like that. She told him they should call the realtor, get it checked, maybe stay in town for a few nights. Dale shook his head. "It's just a wiring quirk," he said. "I'll figure it out." The next morning the lights were still on. Dale unscrewed one of the bulbs in the kitchen, thinking maybe he could see what kind of setup they were dealing with. The bulb was warm to the touch, but not electric warm. It pulsed like something alive. He tried to peer through the glass and saw a flicker of movement inside it, like a spark swimming in liquid. He called Linda over. "Look at this," he said. She leaned close, then stepped back, crossing herself. "That's not a light," she whispered. "That's something else." By that evening, Dale had a plan. He drove into Waco and bought a case of clear glass bulbs, some tools, and after much persuasion from Linda, a small bottle of holy water from St. Mary's. The priest had looked at him oddly when he asked for it, but didn't question further. Back at the house, Dale drained one of the new bulbs and carefully filled it with holy water, sealing it tight. "Let's see what happens when we give these lights something to chew on," he said. He replaced the bulb above the kitchen table, then flipped the switch. The moment the current touched it, the bulb glowed bright white. Not the sickly yellow of the others, but clean and sharp, like sunlight through ice. For a second, they all stood there watching it, hopeful. Then the light began to tremble. The glass quivered in its socket. There came a faint hum, rising fast into a high, sharp cry that pierced through the walls. It was a scream, not mechanical, not human, something in between. April started crying. Linda grabbed her, pulling her away from the table. Dale reached up to unscrew the bulb, but it shattered before he could touch it. Holy water splashed across his arm, steaming on contact, and the house fell silent. Every light went out. It only stayed dark for a heartbeat. Then the glow returned, stronger, more vibrant, seeping from the cracks again, pulsing like a heartbeat through the house. Dale stared at the ceiling, his hand still trembling from the burn. "What the hell is this place?" he whispered. The next days were worse. The lights no longer waited for nightfall. They burned through the day, no matter how many bulbs Dale removed or smashed. He tried cutting the main line from the pole outside, but when he severed it, the cable bled, a thin black ooze that dripped into the dirt and hissed. He dug around the foundation and found no wiring at all, no connection to anything. The house was its own power source. Linda refused to sleep in it after that. She made pallets for the kids out in the truck and said prayers until dawn. But even from the yard, they could see the light through the boards, breathing like a thing alive. 2 nights later, Dale went back inside. He said he wouldn't let a house beat him. He took a crowbar, a flashlight, and one last bulb filled with holy water. Linda begged him not to. "If it screams again," she said, "you come right out." He nodded, but she could see in his eyes he didn't believe in any of it. She waited outside, clutching April close while Evan sat in the truck watching the house. They heard it within minutes. A muffled shriek like glass tearing open, then a deep, guttural moan that seemed to come from the ground itself. The light inside flared so bright the whole yard turned white. Then it went out again. Dead silence. No glow, no hum, no sound, just dark. Linda ran to the porch calling his name. No answer. She stepped inside. The air smelled like ozone and rot. Every bulb was shattered, but the house was still faintly illuminated, as though the walls themselves remembered light. She found the crowbar in the hallway, slick with something thick and warm. When she turned it over, her reflection was warped in the metal, stretched like a funhouse mirror. She called again for Dale, her voice breaking. The only reply came from the kitchen, a low humming that rose softly at first, then louder until the sound filled her head. It was a voice, though not in any language she knew. The words crawled into her mind like insects. Linda stumbled back toward the door, dragging April by the hand. Evan came running, eyes wide. Behind them, the walls began to glow again, but this time the light had color. Red, deep and wet, throbbing like flesh. It pulsed through the floorboards, the ceiling, the air, and in that light, just for a second, Linda saw something moving inside it. A shadow shaped like Dale, or what was left of him. His mouth was open, but no words came out. Only light pouring through his teeth. They fled down Elm Creek Road and didn't stop until they reached town. By morning, when the sheriff drove out to investigate, the house was dark again. They found the truck, the crowbar, the broken glass, but no trace of Dale Hargrove. The house itself was cold, as if it hadn't been lived in for years. The sheriff filed the report, shook his head, and told the family to stay with relatives. But every so often, when the night is clear and the wind dies down, people in Waco say they can see a faint glow on the horizon in the direction of Elm Creek Road, like a house lit from within. Some nights it's yellow, others white, sometimes red. They say it never goes out. And if you listen close enough, when the crickets stop singing, you can still hear the faint hum of a voice calling for someone who's never coming back. The sun was crawling low over the plains when the crew of the Langston No. 9 rig found the old well. It was September of 1957, and the heat had been brutal even for Midland. The men were raw from it, their faces burnt and their patience worn thin, but that night the air cooled just enough for them to notice the strange silence hanging over the flat stretch of scrubland. No wind, no insects, no birds, just the steady metallic whine of the pump jacks and the occasional caw of an iron chain slapping against a rusted barrel. The foreman, Earl Duggan, was the first to spot it. About 50 yards from the drill site, half swallowed by weeds and mesquite, there was a squat concrete mound with a cross nailed crookedly to its center. Barbed wire was wound tight across the top, so many loops of it that it looked like a nest of iron snakes. Beneath the dust, you could see the faint outline of words carved into the slab, but the only part still legible read, "Do not open." The crew stood around it that evening, boots sunk in red dust, watching the last of the daylight sink behind the horizon. Nobody said much. The oldest hand, Red McCrae, spat in the dirt and muttered that it wasn't any of their business. But curiosity runs deep in men who dig for oil. They get used to finding old things underground, and greed or superstition never stopped them long. It was Earl who decided. He said the well had probably been capped during the war, and that if it tied into an old pocket, it might save them days of drilling. He told them they'd break the seal in the morning. The others nodded, half eager, half uneasy. That night, the sky over the rigs burned orange with the flares. The air smelled of diesel and hot iron. Some of the men played cards in the mess tent while others drank in silence. But Red didn't join them. He kept looking toward that dark patch of ground where the crosses gleamed faintly in the moonlight. He'd been working rigs since before most of them were born, and he'd seen enough strange things in the oil fields to know when a place wanted to be left alone. Around midnight, he went out there by himself with a flashlight and a bottle of water. He shone the light across the slab and saw that there were not one but 7 crosses driven into the concrete, each nailed with the same kind of bent railroad spike. The wire around them was old but strong, thick with some kind of black residue that looked like tar. The air above the mound shimmered faintly, though there was no wind. The next morning they went to work. The crew brought out acetylene torches and hammers. sweating through their shirts even before sunrise. It took half the day to get through the wire. The concrete underneath was cracked and soft, and the deeper they went, the worse the smell became. Not just oil, but something sickly, like old meat and iron. Flies began to gather. Nobody could tell where they came from. There hadn't been a single one in days. When the cap finally gave way, the sound it made wasn't right. It wasn't a pop or a hiss, but a low groan, like a deep exhale through a throat full of mud. A blast of air rolled out, thick and black, smelling of rot and gasoline. The men staggered back, coughing. One of them, a young driller named Johnny Pike, laughed nervously and said, "Smells like hell's refinery down there." The wind picked up suddenly. The flare at the main rig sputtered and went out. Every radio within half a mile went dead, replaced by a high whining static. Earl yelled for the generator to be checked, but the engines all stalled one by one, coughing like dying horses. The black vapor that rose from the pit hung in the air, dense as smoke, refusing to drift away. It coiled along the ground, twisting through the grass like something alive. By evening, most of the men were gone. A few had fled on foot, trying to make it back to the road, but the trucks wouldn't start, and even the lanterns dimmed as the sun went down. Earl and Red stayed behind with 2 others to guard the site. They lit a fire near the well, though the flames burned strangely low, as if smothered by the mist. They tried the radios again after dark. The static had changed. It wasn't just noise anymore. Beneath it there was a voice, faint and broken, calling out names. Earl's first, then Johnny's, then a name none of them knew. The voice rasped like metal dragging across stone, and yet it sounded human. Red went pale when he heard it. He said it sounded like Hank Calder, the foreman who had gone missing in '33 back when the first rig in that area went under. Everyone thought Hank had quit and moved to Houston, but the old men used to whisper that something happened to him down in the well, that they'd sealed it because they never found the body. Sometime after midnight, the mist thickened. It rose higher, blotting out the stars, and the fire began to flicker blue. Earl tried to douse it, but the mist clung to his hands like oil. He screamed as it burned his skin, though there was no flame. The others dragged him away, and that's when they saw it, a shape forming inside the cloud. It wasn't solid, but it had weight. A man's outline, shoulders broad, face hidden. It stood at the edge of the pit and tilted its head as if listening. Then, in a low voice that made the ground vibrate, it said, "You shouldn't have opened it, Earl." They ran. Red was the only one who looked back, and he said later he wished he hadn't. The thing that climbed out of the well was covered in black sludge that dripped off it in thick ropes. Its face was the color of ash, and its eyes burned like coals. When it spoke again, it didn't sound like Hank anymore. It sounded like the whole earth groaning. The last thing Red remembered before the world went dark was the feeling of the mist filling his lungs and the sound of 1,000 whispering voices inside his head. He was found 2 days later by a survey crew, wandering the desert 10 miles from the rig. His skin was blistered and his hair had turned white. The others were never recovered. Langston No. 9 was abandoned, its equipment rusting in the sun. The company blamed gas leaks and explosions, though there was no sign of fire. Locals still talk about the place, though few go near it. They say the air tastes like oil out there, and that on certain nights you can see a dim blue flame flicker over the ground where the well once was. Truckers swear their radios go dead on that stretch of road, and if you wait long enough you can hear a man's voice through the static calling out names that don't belong to anyone living. Every few years someone gets the idea to reopen the field, thinking they can find whatever vein was left untapped. But when the survey teams come back, their instruments are always dead, their compasses spinning uselessly. They say the earth hums out there, a low droning that makes your teeth ache and your stomach twist. And if you listen too closely, you might hear the creak of barbed wire and the whisper of a voice that sounds like it's calling you by name. They still call it Oilfield Hollow. Nothing grows there. Nothing ever will. The Galveston Opera House had been rebuilt in defiance of the sea's wrath, its walls standing proud once again against the brine and wind that had nearly erased the city from the map in 1900. By 1910, it was a marvel of restoration, its ornate balconies repainted, its chandelier imported from New Orleans, its marble floors scrubbed of the salt that once crusted every surface. The island had learned to live with ghosts, or at least to ignore them, but the opera house carried something heavier in its air, like the weight of a note held too long in the throat of a dying violin. The hurricane had taken hundreds that night 10 years ago. The ballerina was among them, Elise Duval. 23 years old, born in Beaumont, trained in Paris, adored by every man and envied by every woman who had ever set foot in that theater. She was performing in Swan Lake when the storm hit, when the wind shattered the windows and the roof came down. The survivors swore they had seen her barefoot, trying to gather her troupe and lead them to the stage door, her white dress soaked and clinging to her frame like a second skin. But she never made it out. When they counted the bodies the next morning, hers wasn't there. They said the sea took her. Now every October the locals whispered about strange things in the opera house. The janitors refused to work late. The caretaker, old Mr. Cobb, claimed he heard the boards creak in rhythm, as if someone were dancing across them in the dark. Once, a night watchman quit on the spot after finding a puddle of water stretching from the wings to the center of the stage, glistening like tears in the lamplight. But by morning, the floor was bone dry, except for a faint smell of salt. This year, Halloween fell on a Monday. The Opera House planned a grand gala to mark the occasion, 10 years since the hurricane and the triumphant reopening of the theater. Invitations went out across Galveston, from the Strand to the mansions along Broadway. Everyone who mattered would be there. Merchants, bankers, politicians, and their wives, all eager to forget the dead and toast the living. The stage would be opened again, the orchestra tuned, and a new prima ballerina, young Miss Clara Hensley, would perform a solo tribute in Elise's honor. The night of the gala arrived with a low fog rolling in from the Gulf, swallowing the lamplight in its gray mouth. Inside, the chandeliers burned bright, casting gold across the velvet seats and the polished wood of the balconies. The air smelled of perfume and champagne, but beneath it lingered something faintly metallic like rust or blood. The orchestra played waltzes while guests laughed and clinked glasses, but behind the curtain Clara stood alone, trembling slightly as she laced her slippers. She'd heard the stories. Everyone had. Cobb had told her not to rehearse after dark, muttering something about her not liking it when others took the stage at night. Clara had smiled politely, chalking it up to superstition, but now, standing there in the half-light of the dressing room, she could almost feel eyes watching her. The mirror behind her reflected not just her own pale face, but the empty chairs and shadows moving along the far wall. She turned sharply, but there was nothing there. When the curtain rose, the theater hushed. Clara stepped out, her dress white as sea foam, her arms lifting with practiced grace. The first notes of the music began, slow and haunting, the kind that sounded like memory itself. She moved through the choreography as she'd done 100 times before, but halfway through the second act, the lights flickered. Once, twice. A hum rolled through the ceiling, and the orchestra faltered. Then the air changed. It grew colder, heavy with damp. The audience murmured as a soft mist crept along the stage floor, like fog spilling from a broken wave. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. From the wings came a sound, not footsteps exactly, but something softer, slipper against wood. A rhythmic tapping, perfectly timed to the distant echo of the last notes that had died from the violins. Every light in the house dimmed to a pale glow. The audience leaned forward, whispering. Clara turned toward the sound, her heart pounding. From the darkness at the edge of the stage, a pair of ballet slippers emerged. No legs, no dancer, just the slippers gliding forward as if worn by invisible feet. They moved with poise, turning, leaping, pirouetting in perfect, impossible silence. A murmur rippled through the crowd, then a scream from one of the women in the front row. The slippers twirled faster, water splashing from them with each motion, leaving dark, wet prints that shimmered under the stage lights. Clara backed away, trembling. She could hear the faint sound of breathing, ragged, wet, like someone drowning beneath the boards. Then the music returned, though no one was playing it. The melody of Swan Lake, faint but unmistakable, echoing from nowhere and everywhere at once. The slippers moved closer to Clara. She tried to run, but her feet wouldn't obey. Her body seemed caught, drawn by something unseen. The slippers paused before her, as if studying her, then rose slowly into the air. The crowd gasped as the mist thickened, swirling into the vague outline of a figure. A woman in a white gown, her face pale as the moon, hair floating as though underwater. Her eyes, when they opened, were black pools with no reflection. She looked at Clara, then at the audience. When she spoke, it was like wind passing through broken glass. "You forgot me." The words were barely audible, but everyone heard them. The chandeliers trembled. The fog coiled tighter, the scent of seawater filling the room. Clara stumbled backward, her dress soaked as though she'd stepped into the surf. The ghost raised an arm, graceful even in death, and the slippers turned to her. For a moment she danced, slow, mournful, beautiful beyond anything the living could ever hope to achieve. Then, just as suddenly, she stopped. The ghost's head tilted, and her gaze fixed on a portrait hanging above the stage, an oil painting of the theater's benefactor, Mr. Harold Baines, who had funded the reconstruction after the storm. Her eyes narrowed, the lights flared. The painting burst into flames. The audience screamed and rushed for the exits as smoke filled the air. Cobb, who had been watching from the back, swore later that he saw the ballerina's face twist with rage before she vanished in the blaze, leaving only the slippers behind. They fell to the stage with a heavy wet sound, splattering water across the boards. Clara fainted. When they brought her out into the street, she was still dripping seawater, though the nearest tide was half a mile away. The fire was contained before it could destroy the building, but the opera house never recovered its audience. No one wanted to sit in those seats again to face that stage where the dead had danced. Cobb quit the next day, saying the sea had finally come to claim what was hers. Clara never danced again. She left Galveston, her hair turning white within a year. To this day, when the fog rolls in from the Gulf on Halloween night, the locals say the opera house lights still flicker, and if you stand in the empty balcony long enough, you can hear the faint sound of slippers on wood, soft and steady. Some nights the stage gleams wet with footprints that never dry, and the faint scent of salt drifts through the air. They say she's still dancing, searching for the one who left her to drown, trapped forever between sea and stage, twirling beneath the broken chandelier while the waves whisper her name, Elise Duval, the phantom dancer of Galveston. In 1931, the pine woods around Lufkin, Texas stood tall and still under a cruel sun that baked the red earth and left everything smelling faintly of sap and dust. The depression had swallowed the town whole. Men leaned on fences because there was nowhere to go and nothing to do, and women prayed for their husbands to come home with food instead of shame. The only thing that seemed to thrive was faith, or something that pretended to be faith. That was when Reverend Silas Boone came to town, driving a cracked and dented truck with a wooden cross tied to the back. He was thin as a scarecrow, his black suit too long in the arms, his eyes the color of wet gravel. On the side of his truck, painted in crooked letters, were the words, "The hand of the Lord heals all poison." He set up a tent by the river, where the trees bent low and the air stayed damp even in the worst heat. Folks came from miles away to see what he'd do. The first night he preached about the serpent in the wilderness, how the Israelites were healed by looking upon it. His voice rasped like sandpaper against the air, and people said it carried the sound of God's wrath and mercy both. Then he reached into a wooden crate and lifted out a coiled rattlesnake as long as his arm. It hissed, tail buzzing like a dry rattle in the still night, and he smiled at it like a man greeting an old friend. He said the Lord gave dominion over all creeping things, and if you believed, the venom would turn to water in your veins. The first man to take the dare was young Joe Pritchard, who'd lost his job at the mill and was half mad with hunger and pride. He took the snake in his hands, let it bite him on the wrist, and drank from a cup of yellowed venom mixed with milk. He should have died, but he didn't. The crowd gasped when he stood tall and raised his hand, no swelling, no pain, his eyes shining like a man reborn. That was all it took. Word spread through Lufkin faster than a brush fire. People came limping, coughing, shaking, begging for the same miracle. Boone said the Lord's mercy was endless and his snakes were proof. They built him a church out of pine boards by the edge of town before the first frost, a squat building with no windows, just candles inside that made the shadows writhe on the walls. By Halloween, the congregation had doubled twice over. They sang louder, shouted harder, and drank deeper. Boone said the poison was a test of faith, a taste of hell turned sweet by grace. His followers lined up one after another to be struck and saved. They said the venom made them feel clean, like their sins burned away from the inside. No one questioned it when the bite marks lingered like faint kisses, or when they began to dream of hissing voices whispering beneath the floorboards. They'd wake in the night with the sound of scales dragging across the wood. But Boone told them it was the Lord moving through them, testing their faith. They believed him, because by then they didn't believe in anything else. The sheriff stopped by once, a big man named Tully Reed who'd fought in the Great War and didn't scare easy. He told Boone the town was nervous, that snakes didn't belong in a church. Boone smiled that crooked smile and offered him a cup of milk. Tully refused. "Faith don't need tricks," he said. Boone's eyes went flat, cold as stone. "Then you don't know faith at all," he answered. The next morning, Tully's horse was found dead by the river, its body swollen and its face frozen in a silent scream. No one could say what killed it, but everyone whispered. As October waned, the sky turned heavy with rain that never came. The woods around the church went quiet, even the crickets stopped. Boone said the Lord was stirring the earth, ready to purge the wicked. He announced a special service for Halloween night, a night of reckoning and rebirth. Every pew was filled, candles burning low, shadows crawling up the walls. The snakes lay coiled in boxes beneath the pulpit, silent as the grave. Boone stood before them, face gleaming with sweat, and said that the time of trial had come. He told them to drink once more to prove that faith was stronger than death. They obeyed because by then, his voice was the only thing they trusted. Outside, the wind rose like something alive. The pine trees creaked, their roots groaning deep in the soil. Then came the sound, faint at first, then building. A dry, steady rustle like 1,000 grains of rice poured across a wooden floor. The candles flickered. Someone screamed. The floorboards began to move. From the cracks between the planks, the first snake slid through, a thick rattler with eyes like wet glass. Then another, and another. They came in silence, pouring up through the floor like water, their bodies glistening in the candlelight. Boone didn't move. He stood there, arms outstretched as the snakes climbed his legs, coiling around his body. His voice rose, cracked but defiant. "Be not afraid," he shouted. "They are the Lord's messengers." But the congregation was not saved. The snakes moved through them like living fire. They bit the hands that had once held them, the faces that had kissed their scales. People screamed, stumbled, fell, but no one ran. They were mesmerized, caught between terror and rapture. The sound filled the church, the dry, endless rattle of tales and the choking gasps of the faithful. The candles went out one by one. In the dark, the hissing grew louder, as if the floor itself had come alive. When the sheriff came the next morning, the church was silent. The door stood open, swinging on its hinges. Inside, there was no one left alive. The pews were overturned, the floor littered with snakes that lay still and cold, their bellies bloated with what they had consumed. Boone stood behind the pulpit, his arms outstretched as if still preaching, his skin pale and glistening. The snakes had burrowed into him through his sleeves, his mouth, his eyes. His lips were frozen in a half-smile and his teeth were black. The sheriff shut the door and burned the place to the ground. He didn't speak of it again, and neither did the town. Years later, when the drought came back and the riverbed cracked open, children found bones there, tangled in roots, still marked with faint punctures. They said you could hear the rattling on hot nights when the air stood still and the moon was thin. The old folks warned their kids to stay away from the river and never trust a man who said he could make death obey. But sometimes when the wind came from the east, they swore they heard a voice drifting through the pines, hoarse and whispering, calling the faithful home. The night the thing came down over Sulphur Creek started like any other late summer night in Lamar County. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of pine sap and damp soil, and the crickets were singing so loud it was almost like the woods themselves were trying to drown out something they didn't want to hear. Folks in Paris, Texas had seen storms roll through that rattled their bones, but no one could remember a night that began so still and ended so wrong. Around 9 o'clock, people across the northern edge of the county said they saw a streak of light cross the sky, brighter than lightning and burning green. Some thought it was a meteor, some said a plane. Old Man Tully down by the Sulphur Creek Bridge swore it split the clouds apart and vanished behind the tree line with a sound like a church bell being rung underwater. The air changed after that. The crickets stopped. The dogs started howling one after another like a signal passing through them. Sheriff Ed Mayfield got the first call a little after 10. A farmer out near the creek said something had hit his field, but there wasn't any fire. Just a weird humming that wouldn't stop. Ed figured maybe a small plane had gone down and told his deputies to grab their flashlights. He didn't mention it to his wife, but his son, 15-year-old Jimmy, overheard and begged to go along. Ed hesitated, then relented. The boy had been talking about joining the Air Force one day. Maybe this would teach him what real accidents looked like. They drove out past the darkened storefronts through the back roads that snaked between cattle fields until they reached the line of trees where the air smelled of burnt metal. The headlights cut across something that shimmered faintly, wet grass flattened in a perfect circle. The humming was there, low and steady like a beehive miles underground. Ed told the boy to stay close. The sound seemed to get inside their heads. They found it half buried in the creek bed. A metallic shape the size of a wagon but smooth all over, no seams, no rivets. Its surface glistened with some kind of slick gray slime that steamed in the night air. The thing pulsed faintly, like it was breathing. Jimmy crouched closer and touched the mud around it. It was warm. The sheriff called out to it, asked if anyone was inside, but no voice came back, only that steady hum. Then something moved. It slid out from a gap that hadn't been there a second earlier. The figure stumbled into the water, pale in the beam of the flashlight. It looked like a man, naked and shivering with eyes too wide and skin that reflected the light like glass. Ed shouted for him to stop. The man looked at them, opened his mouth, and asked, "What year is this?" His voice was human but hollow, like it came from a long tunnel. Jimmy answered before his father could. 1954, he said. The man blinked slowly, then smiled in a way that made Jimmy step back. He whispered something the sheriff couldn't hear, and then he collapsed in the mud. Ed hauled him out and wrapped him in a blanket from the truck. He was cold to the touch, colder than any corpse Ed had ever felt. They took him back to town, to the old clinic off Main Street where Dr. Harlan agreed to look him over. By morning, the whole town was whispering. Some said the sheriff had found a Russian pilot. Others said it was one of those flying saucers from the papers. But when Ed went back to the creek at dawn, the object was gone. The mud showed no tracks, no marks, no heat. Only that circle of dead grass remained and a smell in the air like rotten eggs. At the clinic, the man had woken up. He was calm, polite even, but he wouldn't say his name. He kept asking questions about the president, about what kind of radios people used, about whether there were still launches. Dr. Harlan said his blood wasn't right. Too thick, dark as molasses. The sheriff told him to keep it quiet, that the Air Force would be coming soon.
Jimmy visited the man that afternoon.
He said his name was Thomas, though it sounded like he had to think about it first. He asked Jimmy to describe the night sky to him, where the stars were, how they moved. When Jimmy couldn't answer, Thomas smiled again, the same slow, wrong smile. He said he used to live near here once, long ago, before the water turned bad. Jimmy didn't understand. But something about the way he said it made him think of the old tales about the creek, how the animals that drank from it sometimes went blind. That night the power went out across town. Every clock stopped at the same time, 11:43. People later swore they heard a noise like 1,000 insects vibrating in the walls. The sheriff's radio died, and even the church bell on the square started ringing on its own. When Ed reached the clinic, the front door was open. Dr. Harlan was gone. The man was gone. Jimmy was sitting on the floor, shaking. He said Thomas had gotten up, stared at him, and said, "It's starting again." Then he'd touched the wall and walked straight through it. Ed didn't believe it until he saw the prints. Long, smeared handprints leaving streaks of that same gray slime down the plaster. Over the next week, livestock started disappearing. A cow found near the creek had no eyes, but no blood either. A fisherman downstream said the water glowed faintly at night. The sheriff tried to bring in help, but every time someone drove out to the site, their engines would die. The hum returned just beneath the surface of hearing. It followed people home. One night, Ed found his boy standing outside barefoot in the field, staring toward the trees. He said he could hear Thomas calling to him from the creek, saying it was safe now, that he could come see what was under the water. Ed dragged him back inside, locked the doors, and stayed up till dawn with his shotgun in hand. By the next morning, the creek had turned a sickly yellow. The fish floated belly up, their scales flaking off like ash. People started leaving town. They said something was in the woods, watching them, whispering through the phone lines even when they were cut. Jimmy grew quiet. He said he could see lights moving under the ground, hear engines that weren't there. 2 weeks later, Sheriff Mayfield drove out alone to the creek and never came back. They found his truck idling on the bridge, door open, radio crackling with static. No sign of a struggle, just his hat lying in the mud. The only thing written in his notebook was a single line: "It knows where it is now." By the end of the month, the Army showed up, sealed the area, and told everyone to stay clear. They drained part of the creek, bulldozed the fields, and said it was a contamination leak from an old refinery. The newspapers ran the story once, then dropped it. Jimmy left town soon after. Some say he joined the Air Force, but others claim he never made it past Dallas. A man matching his description was seen years later wandering along a road outside Hugo, barefoot and humming, his eyes glassy, his skin pale as frost. Locals still talk about the nights when the air hums over Sulphur Creek, when the frogs stop croaking and the wind carries the smell of sulfur again. They say if you stand on the bridge long enough, you can hear a voice asking what year it is. No one stays long enough to answer. The summer of 1973 in Bastrop County felt heavier than usual, like the air itself had turned to syrup. The heat didn't just cling, it smothered. The Ramsey farm sat 6 miles off Highway 71, hemmed in by pine and cedar so thick the sun barely made it through. Out there, nights weren't just dark, they were soundless except for the insects and the wind that moaned low through the trees. The Ramsey family had lived on that land for 3 generations, long enough for the boards of their farmhouse to turn gray and soft as old bone. The trouble started with the noises. At first it was only the cows, restless and bawling after dark, spooked by something in the fields. Then came the thuds from the barn, like someone dropped a heavy load of lumber against the far wall. Frank Ramsey, a man in his 50s with a back bowed from farm work, brushed it off as raccoons or maybe some kids fooling around. His wife, Mabel, didn't sleep much after that. She swore she heard whispering when the wind died down, something that rose and fell like breathing. Their son, 16-year-old David, was the first to find the skin. It was early morning, pale light leaking through the slats in the barn. He went in to feed the horses and smelled it first, something foul, sweet and sickly like meat left in the sun. He thought maybe one of the strays had dragged in a carcass. When he reached the back wall, he saw it hanging from a rusted nail, fluttering slightly in the breeze that came through a crack. At first he didn't understand what he was looking at. It was tanned and thin like parchment, but there were freckles on it and a faint outline of a belly button. He dropped the feed bucket and ran back to the house so fast he didn't notice his own footprints in the spilled grain. The sheriff came out that afternoon, a heavy-set man named Porter who always smelled of chewing tobacco. He took one look at the thing and turned green around the gills. He asked Frank if he'd been tanning hides again, and when Frank said no, Porter muttered something about kids playing pranks and took it away in a sack. But nobody laughed about it after nightfall. That night, David lay awake in his upstairs room, listening to the crickets and the occasional croak of frogs from the pond. He could see the barn from his window, a black shape against the deeper black of the woods. Somewhere past midnight he heard it, the faint sputter of the chainsaw starting up, choking and coughing like an animal trying to breathe. It stopped, then started again, steadier this time. The sound carried clear through the night air, and with it came something else, a voice low and drawn out, whispering through the noise. "Keep cutting." He froze. The whisper was faint but certain, slithering through the thrum of the saw. He waited, too terrified to move. After a minute, the sound stopped, and the silence that followed felt thicker than before. When morning came, the chainsaw was right where it had always been, on the workbench, its blade spotless. Over the next few nights, the whisper came back. Sometimes it called from the barn, sometimes from just beyond the tree line. "Keep cutting." It always came when the wind died, David told his father. But Frank just shook his head and said he was dreaming. Frank was old enough to remember when folks in Bastrop County still whispered about the Skinner place a few miles down the road, where a man had supposedly made masks out of his victims after the war. He didn't like stories like that, didn't want them in his house. Then one morning, they found the animals gone. Every pig, every chicken, even the old cow, all of them vanished without a sound. There was no sign of struggle, no broken fences, no blood, just emptiness. Frank spent that afternoon cleaning his shotgun and muttering about thieves. Mabel cried in the kitchen, saying something evil was on their land. That night, when she turned in, She said she heard the chainsaw start again, faint and far away. By the fourth night, Frank decided he'd had enough. He told David they were going out to the barn together to prove it was all nonsense. The moon was half full, pale and milky behind a film of clouds. They carried flashlights and the shotgun, stepping through the brittle grass toward the barn. The air was damp like rain that never fell. Inside, it was colder than it should have been. Their flashlights cut thin white tunnels through the dark, showing dust and cobwebs and empty stalls. Then David saw it. Something dangled from the rafters again, the shape of it familiar, pale and smooth. He stepped closer and realized there were several pieces this time, strips and patches of skin, some large as a man's chest, some no bigger than a hand. They were tacked up with nails, edges curling inward, glistening faintly as if still wet. The air stank of iron and rot. Frank swore under his breath and backed away. His light trembled on the far wall, where the chainsaw hung by its cord. It wasn't plugged in, but the blade twitched just a fraction like a muscle under skin. Then came the whisper again, right beside them, low and wet, the words crawling out of the dark. "Keep cutting." The saw roared to life. David stumbled backward, knocking over a bucket. The flashlight beam jumped across the wall, catching glimpses of the skin swaying like paper lanterns. Frank fired once, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The shot tore a hole through the back of the barn, but the saw didn't stop. It shrieked louder, jerking on its hook until it fell to the ground, blade spinning. The whisper turned into a rasping moan that filled every corner of the barn. They ran. The next morning, the sheriff found the barn door open and the Ramseys gone. There was blood in the dirt, a long, dark trail leading into the trees. He followed it for half a mile until it just ended, like something had dragged the trail out of existence. The only thing left was the chainsaw, sitting upright at the edge of the woods, blade clean, motor still warm. A week later, a neighbor driving past at dusk swore he saw lights flickering in the Ramsey barn again, said he heard the saw whining, faint but steady, and thought he saw a shape moving in the window. Porter didn't bother checking. He closed the road instead and told folks to leave that place be. By autumn, the farm was empty, reclaimed by weeds and kudzu. The walls of the barn leaned inward, and when the wind blew just right, people said they could still hear that whisper drifting through the pines. "Keep cutting." Nobody stayed long enough to find out what it meant. Beaumont, Texas, 1952, was a place that smelled of oil and dust, of frying grease and train smoke, and the heavy sweetness of pine that drifted from the east. The streets were quiet at night, except for the distant clatter of freight cars and the hum of cicadas. When Samuel Borden returned to town after 20 years away, the first thing he noticed was that the air hadn't changed, but the people had. They stared longer, spoke less. He hadn't planned to come back, but the letter from a lawyer had arrived with his name printed neatly on the envelope. "Your uncle, Mr. Everett Borden, has passed away. As his only living kin, you have inherited his property on 9th Street, Borden House Boarding." He didn't remember his uncle much. Just a man with narrow eyes, yellowed fingers, and a habit of speaking like he was saving his words for something important. When Samuel was a boy, Everett had run that same boarding house, renting rooms to refinery workers, drifters, and the occasional railroad man. His mother used to warn him never to go there after dark. She said Everett's house had thin walls and listening floors. The house sat at the edge of downtown Beaumont, 3 stories of narrow windows and peeling white paint. It loomed against the orange sky as Samuel parked his truck in the dirt lot beside it. The porch sagged and the railing leaned like it wanted to escape. The sign above the door still read Borden House in faded gold letters. The lawyer had left the key under the mat, wrapped in paper that smelled of mildew. Inside, the air was cool and damp. The smell of age hung thick in every room, wood polish, old linen, and something faintly metallic beneath it. The floorboards creaked with each step, not from decay but from memory, as though they recognized him. In the parlor, dust sheets covered the furniture, but the wallpaper still showed the faint pattern of roses yellowed with time. He wandered through the house until he found the office. His uncle's old desk still stood by the window, a ledger open on top. The last entry was dated 3 months before Everett's death. 4 names were listed, all marked paid on current. He went upstairs, counting each door. 8 rooms in total, each with a brass number and keyhole, each locked except for the last. Inside, the air was colder. The bed was made, sheets tight, and a suitcase sat open on the dresser. Women's clothes carefully folded, a rosary laid on top. He flipped through the bureau drawers, all empty, and then checked the closet. Only a faint perfume lingered there, sharp and unfamiliar. By dusk, he'd found a rhythm to the place. The pipes groaned, the walls settled, and somewhere deep below the floor came a sound like dripping water. When he checked the cellar door, it was bolted from the outside. His uncle's handwriting was carved faintly into the wood. "Do not enter after dark." That night he slept in one of the upstairs rooms, though the house made it difficult. The wind pressed at the windows and he thought he heard someone walking the hallway, slow, deliberate steps that paused outside his door. When he called out, silence fell heavy and the floorboards stilled. He told himself it was the wood shifting in the humidity. Beaumont was always humid. The next morning he went into town for supplies. At the diner, the waitress recognized the name on his tab. "Borden House, huh?" she said, her voice tight. "You got guts, mister. Folks don't stay long in that place." "What do you mean?" he asked. She shrugged, looking out the window as if the street might be listening. "People rent rooms, then disappear. Cops came through a few times, but there's nothing to find. Rooms locked from the inside. They're things left behind. It's been happening since before the war. Everett always said they ran off without paying. But folks here, we know better." That evening, Samuel returned to the house with a can of oil for the locks. He unbolted the cellar door and descended the stairs, the light of his lantern flickering against stone walls slick with moisture. The air was heavy, almost wet. The basement stretched farther than he remembered from childhood. 3 low rooms lined with shelves of paint cans and rusted tools. At the far end, against the back wall, he saw it, stacks of old trunks and suitcases. He opened one. Inside were men's clothes folded neatly, a pair of boots placed on top, and a wallet that still held identification. Robert M. Clay, Port Arthur. He opened another trunk, women's clothes this time, a handbag, letters tied with string. One by one he counted 12 in all, each belonging to someone different. All of them left behind. Behind the stacks, half hidden by a broken wardrobe, was a square of wood set into the concrete floor. A trapdoor. The edges were worn smooth, the handle polished from use. He pulled it open. A breath of cold air rose from below, carrying the faint smell of candle wax and something older, something sweet and foul. A narrow ladder descended into blackness. He hesitated, then lit his lantern again and climbed down. The passage was stone, carved roughly, wide enough for one man. It sloped gently downward, and along both sides were small alcoves cut into the wall. In each alcove sat a candle, tall and white, yet their flames were motionless, perfectly still, and when he held his hand near them, there was no heat. He walked deeper. The tunnel wound like a vein beneath the earth, and the sound of dripping water grew louder until he realized it wasn't water at all, but a slow, wet breathing from somewhere ahead. The air grew colder, pressing against his skin like damp cloth. When he rounded a bend, he saw that the tunnel opened into a wide chamber. In the center stood a wooden chair and a small table, and on that table were things, rings, watches, a cracked photograph, and beside them an open book written in his uncle's hand. He read the first line, "To house the forgotten, one must feed the house." Each page was filled with dates, names, and phrases that made no sense. 3 gone, 2 remain. The tunnel breathes when fed. Candles stay lit for those still beneath. As he read, he heard a sound behind him, a shuffling, faint, as though someone dragged their feet along stone. When he turned, the candles nearest him flickered, not like normal flame, but as though they were breathing too. A voice spoke softly from the dark, almost human, but with a hollow echo to it. "You shouldn't have come down here, Samuel." It was his uncle's voice. The air grew thick, hard to breathe. The figure that stepped forward was pale and translucent, the outline of a man in work clothes, eyes like 2 pits of soot. "You were supposed to keep the house," the voice said, "not disturb it." Samuel backed away, but the tunnel behind him was already closing, the walls trembling, narrowing. The ghostly figure raised a hand and the candles flared with silent light. "It needs them, boy," Everett said. "The ones who come seeking rest. They feed what lies below. I only kept it quiet." The floor shuddered, and beneath the dirt he heard movement, like dozens of whispering mouths just beneath his feet. The table rattled, and the objects upon it began to sink into the ground, swallowed whole by unseen hands. Samuel turned and ran, lantern swinging wildly. The tunnel stretched longer now, impossibly long, the ladder far away. The candles along the walls burned brighter, the air thick with the scent of wax and rot. Something brushed his ankle, a hand cold and soft, then another. He climbed the ladder in a frenzy, pushing the trapdoor open and slamming it shut behind him. He bolted the cellar door, his heart hammering against his ribs. By morning, the house was silent again. He'd packed his truck ready to leave Beaumont behind, but when he looked toward the cellar door one last time, he saw wax dripping from the hinges, forming long, pale trails down to the floor. That night, 20 miles outside town, he stopped at a motel. He turned on the radio, trying to drown out his thoughts. But beneath the static, he swore he heard breathing. In the mirror above the sink, behind his reflection, faint shapes flickered, white candles burning without flame. When the motel clerk came to check the room the next morning, the bed was made, the suitcase neatly packed. The room was locked from the inside. The clerk told the police it was just like the others. Another traveler passing through. Another name to add to the ledger of the Borden House of Beaumont. The desert around Big Bend is the kind of place that seems to hum even when it's silent. Wind runs its fingers through the canyons and dry grass, and you get the sense that the land remembers things better left forgotten. In the summer of 1991, a small group of campers found that out the hard way. They were 3 college friends from Austin, Evan, Lisa, and Mark, out to spend a long weekend under the stars. They drove a beat-up Chevy Blazer that smelled like gasoline and sweat, loaded with tents, cheap beer, and a rented camcorder. It was Evan's idea to film their trip, to make some kind of travel diary for a film project. They didn't know that by the end of that trip, the footage would become evidence in an open investigation that never closed. The first night passed without anything unusual. They camped near the Rio Grande, not far from the Santa Elena Canyon, where the cliffs rise like cathedral walls out of the desert floor. Lisa said the place felt too big, too quiet. She wasn't wrong. At night, when the wind died and the fire burned low, you could hear the shifting of rocks and faint echoes from somewhere deep in the canyons, like the desert itself was breathing. They laughed it off as coyotes. The second night, it changed. Around 2 a.m, Lisa woke to something screaming in the distance. She said later that it wasn't an animal sound. It had that warbling pitch coyotes make. But there was something underneath it. A human note, like a man wailing through clenched teeth. She shook Evan awake, and they listened together. The scream came again, closer this time. Mark stumbled out of his tent half asleep, muttering that it was just a mountain lion. But when they all listened together, the sound came one more time, cutting through the night like a blade, and even Mark went pale. It wasn't a lion. Evan grabbed the camcorder and started filming the darkness. You can still hear his whisper on the recovered tape. It sounds like it's right behind those rocks. The footage shows nothing but desert and shadow, but if you turn the volume up, you can hear something heavy moving just beyond the edge of the firelight. A crunch of gravel, a slow dragging step. Then the sound stops. Silence. And then another scream, closer, sharper, almost inhuman. The tape cuts there. The next morning, they were all shaken. They decided to pack up and head north toward Panther Junction, where the ranger station sat about 20 miles out. On the way, they stopped at a narrow dirt road branching toward the Chisos Mountains. Evan insisted they check out an old trail he'd read about, the Pine Canyon Trail, where a few hikers had gone missing over the years. Lisa argued against it, but Mark sided with Evan. They parked near a dry wash and hiked in. By midday, the air had grown heavy, thick with heat. They found animal tracks in the sand, coyote, deer, but one set looked wrong. Too long, the toes too pronounced, like human prints but deeper, wider. Mark crouched down and measured them with his hand. Whatever made them had to be close to 7 feet tall. They kept walking until they reached a cluster of boulders, one of which had a black opening at its base. A cave. Lisa didn't want to go in. The air coming out of the hole was cold, carrying the faint stench of rot. Evan said they'd just look around the entrance, film a little, and leave. On the tape, you can see him shining his flashlight into the cave, the beam catching pale bones scattered across the floor. Some were small, rabbits maybe, but others were larger. A deer skull, half buried in sand. And then at the back of the cave, something else. A human rib cage, cracked open like a shell. Mark swore and stumbled backward. Lisa screamed at them to leave. That's when the camcorder picks up a sound that's hard to describe. A long, rasping moan that turns into a breathy growl, somewhere deep within the cave. They ran. The tape shows the ground jerking wildly as Evan bolts through the desert. You can hear Lisa sobbing and Mark shouting, "It's following us." Then another scream, the same terrible human-like howl, closer and clearer now. It echoed across the canyons until it sounded like there were a dozen voices crying at once. They didn't stop until they reached the truck. When they looked back, nothing moved behind them. At Panther Junction, they told the rangers what they'd found. Ranger Thomas Heller led a small team out that afternoon. They followed the campers' tracks back to the cave and radioed in around sunset. The official report says they found bones, both human and animal, but no sign of any creature. The bones were gnawed clean, and the markings didn't match any known predator. The bites were too uniform, the spacing too narrow, like a person had done it. Heller stayed at the scene after dark, documenting the evidence. Around 9:40 p.m., he made his last radio call. His voice was calm but strained. He said he could hear something howling from the ridge, and that it didn't sound like a coyote or a man. The transmission cut out mid-sentence. The next morning, a second team found Heller's truck still parked at the site. His flashlight lay on the ground near the cave entrance. Inside, they found his notebook and the remnants of his uniform, shirt torn, soaked with blood. Heller himself was never found. Only his hat lying neatly beside the bones. After that, Big Bend closed off the area around Pine Canyon for nearly a decade. Officially, it was due to unstable terrain. Unofficially, everyone knew better. Locals started calling it the Howler's Den. A few campers claimed to hear it at night, especially when the moon was thin and the wind died. The sound carried far across the desert, a high, strangled scream that rose and fell like someone being torn apart. Rangers who stayed long enough said it came from something that walked on two legs but didn't move like a man. They said it left tracks that started with human footprints and ended in claw marks. In 1991, Evan and Lisa gave their statements, turned over the camcorder, and left Texas for good. Mark never made it out. He disappeared a week later after returning to the park alone, saying he wanted to prove it was all in their heads. His car was found near the same wash, the doors locked, the keys still in the ignition. The driver's seat was soaked in blood, and on the windshield, drawn in that same blood, was a single handprint. Too long, too narrow, with fingers that ended in points. The camcorder footage was copied and sealed by the Park Service, marked Unverified Wildlife Distress Incident. But there's one part of the tape they never released. It's only a few seconds long. The final frame shows the entrance of that cave just before the battery dies. And if you brighten the footage enough, you can see something standing in the shadows. Upright, broad-shouldered, its skin pale as bone. Its mouth is open, and rows of teeth glint in the light like wet glass. People still go missing in Big Bend. Not often, but often enough to keep the stories alive. At night, the rangers say, when the wind goes still and the coyotes fall silent, you can hear it again, the howler of Big Bend, calling across the desert for the ones who got away. In the autumn of 1898, Fredericksburg, Texas was a quiet town of limestone streets and German voices. The wind carried the scent of mesquite smoke, and the nights were long enough that people started locking their doors before the sun dipped below the peach orchards. At the far end of Main Street stood a shop with no sign. Its windows were filled with clocks, tall and narrow, short and wide, some gilded, others carved from black walnut. The man who owned the shop was named Albrecht Koenig, a clockmaker from the Rhineland who'd arrived 15 years earlier with a steamer trunk full of gears and a heart full of ghosts. Albrecht was not like the other Germans in town. He rarely attended church, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the kind of stillness that made people lower theirs in turn. He lived alone behind his shop, and though his hair had gone white, his eyes were sharp, clockmaker's eyes that measured the world in fractions of a second. The townsfolk would sometimes see him walking to the river at dawn, carrying a small wooden box. He would set it down by the bank, stand motionless for several minutes, and then return home, the box empty. No one ever asked what he did there, not directly. In Fredericksburg, some questions were best left to God. The clocks were his livelihood, but they were also his obsession. He built them for the courthouse, the church, the schoolhouse, and for families who wanted something beautiful to outlast them. They said that when Albrecht finished a clock, he whispered a name into its casing before sealing it. A name of someone who had died, perhaps, or someone soon to. The rumors began after the widow Mertz's boy disappeared. It was Halloween of 1886, the first time the clock struck 13. That night, as always, the townsfolk gathered at the square. The children carved pumpkins and the old men drank beer in the cold. At midnight, when the moon sat directly above the steeple, every clock in Fredericksburg began to chime. They struck 12 but didn't stop. A 13th toll rolled through the town, heavy and long. The air went still, the lanterns flickered, and when the sound faded, little Jacob Mertz was gone. His mother swore she had been holding his hand. The next morning, the sheriff found only his small shoes by the shop's back door. Albrecht said nothing. He closed his shutters for 3 days and didn't reopen until the following Sunday. The town might have driven him out, but Fredericksburg was a place that believed in omens, and no one wanted to be the first to tempt one. So they carried on, though every year as Halloween approached, a quiet dread settled over Main Street. And every year as the clockmaker grew older and his hands shook more, his clocks grew stranger. In 1898, the year this story finds its breath, the town had changed. The train came through twice a day now, and the church had a new bell from San Antonio. But Albrecht remained the same. His shop smelled of oil and cedar dust, and the walls ticked with dozens of heartbeats that never faltered. I was 17 that year, apprenticed to the blacksmith, and my room faced the clockmaker's shop. On the last week of October, I began to notice something odd. None of the clocks showed the same time. They had always been perfectly synchronized, but now each one ran slightly fast or slow, as though time itself were slipping apart inside those wooden cases. The night before Halloween, I couldn't sleep. The wind was restless, carrying the dry hiss of oak leaves. Around 11, I saw a light in Albrecht's shop. He was standing at his workbench, tightening a spring inside a large grandfather clock unlike any I'd ever seen. Its face was silver, etched with stars, and at the center where the hands met was a tiny keyhole. He worked with a care that bordered on reverence. Then, without warning, he looked up, straight at me. His expression was unreadable, but I remember feeling as if I'd been caught listening at a door I shouldn't even know existed. The next day, the town was gray, with the promise of rain. I saw Albrecht outside, hanging a black cloth over his window. The children whispered that it meant another clock was finished. At dusk, I followed him to the cemetery. He walked slowly, carrying a small clock wrapped in cloth. He knelt by a grave so old the name had worn away and buried the clock at its base. I watched from behind a fence, the air sharp with the smell of damp earth. When he was done, he stood, removed his hat, and whispered something to the headstone. Then he turned toward me, his face pale as the limestone markers around him. "Go home," he said. Before the chime. That night, no one slept easy. At midnight, the first bell tolled from the courthouse. One by one, every clock in Fredericksburg joined in, their notes climbing over each other in waves of sound. I counted them, heart-pounding, 10, 11, 12, then came the 13th. The air seemed to tear apart. The sound was deeper, older, like something rising from beneath the ground. Windows rattled, dogs howled, and for a moment I could swear I heard voices within the chime, whispering names, dozens of them, each spoken between the metallic strikes. When it ended, the silence was worse. I stumbled outside. The street was empty, the sky a strange shade of copper. The clockmaker's shop door was open. Inside, every clock had stopped at the same time, 12:59, and Albrecht was gone. On his bench lay the silver-faced clock, its hands pointing at 13. I turned the key that was still in its hole. The clock began to tick again, but the sound wasn't mechanical. It was faintly human, a slow breathing rhythm. I leaned closer and heard a whisper. My name. The next morning, they searched the town. The sheriff said he must have left during the night, but there were no footprints and his horse was still in the stable. The only clue was a trail of wet earth leading from his shop toward the cemetery. They followed it until it vanished among the graves. When they dug near the spot where he'd buried the clock, the earth was hollow. Beneath it was a small chamber lined with mirrors. In the center sat a stool, and on the stool was a watch still ticking. Its face was cracked, but inside, behind the glass, was a single moving eye. They sealed the chamber, built a fence around the cemetery, and for a time the clocks in town were silent. But the following year, when Halloween came again, every one of them, even those bought years before, even those kept locked in attics, struck 13. The sound rolled across the fields and through the houses, and when it faded, Mrs. Adler, who lived above the bakery, was gone. They found her nightgown folded neatly on her bed and a small clock ticking on her pillow. To this day, no one in Fredericksburg builds clocks. The shop still stands, though the glass is thick with dust. And if you listen, late on Halloween night, you can hear the faint ticking of something deep within its walls. Some say it's the wind. Others say it's the sound of the dead keeping time, waiting for the 13th chime when another will join them. And sometimes when I walk past, I swear I can still hear that whisper, soft and patient, calling my name from behind the door. I was 19 the summer the light came up out of the river like it had been sleeping there. San Angelo was a bowl of heat and dust in 1979, the kind of heat that burns smell out of things. You could walk past a feed store and not smell the grain, walk past a bar and not smell the beer, but you always smelled the water where the concho slips through and makes the town possible. We had our places, the Sonic with car hops who pretended not to know us, the Dairy Queen off Bryant where the air refused to cool, the little strip by Lake Nasworthy where the water went green and still under the cottonwoods. We had our cars with the radios that never shut up, and we had each other because that's what you do when you are young and every road points out of town but never really leaves it. The light began as a dare. Cody said he had seen it twice, and that was enough to make him an authority. He was 2 years older than me, less hair, more stories. He worked the night shift at a gas station on Knickerbocker, and had a way of leaning across the counter, talking low like he was telling you the thing you were supposed to spend your whole life looking for. Raylene believed him because she believed the good parts of people first. She and Cody had a thing that was too new to be called anything. The sort of thing that keeps its own temperature and makes the air sweat even when you stand apart. They were both in love with the same idea, I think, which was that something could happen here that wasn't on TV and didn't need a bus ticket. We had our urban legends. Folks talked about the Marfa lights like they were visiting cousins, but the thing we had was supposed to be older, meaner, something that came up from graves people dug without saying the names out loud. My grandmother called it a corpse light and swore it was a lantern for the dead who forgot the way. She said if you followed it, you would end up where you were going all along. She said it like a warning and a promise both. I laughed when I was little, and she pinched my ear and told me that out here the ground keeps secrets better than churches do. On the night that mattered, we met at the Whataburger on Sherwood Way and ate too fast. The parking lot was a quilt of headlights and high school pride. Someone had brought a boombox and it coughed out music that sounded like it had been rained on. Cody's blue Nova wore its dust like a badge and idled as if it were impatient with us. He drummed his fingers on the vinyl and kept checking the mirror even when the engine was off. He said the light shows after 11 because it likes people who should be home by then. Said it liked the way the wind talked after the trains quit blowing their horns. Raylene climbed into the front with him and I got in the back. She smelled like pond water and drugstore perfume. And when she turned, her eyes reflected the dashboard lights in coin-sized glints. She told me I didn't have to come if I didn't want to. I told her I wanted to because in that moment it felt better to be there and hear the hum of the tires under my feet than to be anywhere else thinking about nothing. The car's radio stuck between stations until it found a song we almost knew, and then it lost it again, the words stuttering into static. We laughed about it like the car was playing around, like mischief came in wires. Cody took us down Bryant toward 87, past the mall that still smelled of new carpet, past the tire shop with the busted sign that insisted it was open for business, past the places where people were finishing their days. We turned off on a farm-to-market road that turned into something without lines. The fields lay flat and black, and the wind ran across them without slowing. Prickly pear punctured the ditches like accidents that got comfortable. Cody killed the radio, rolled the windows down, and said to listen. We listened to the engine and the wind and the sound of human mouths forgetting what to say. When the road climbed a little, you could see the town's lights behind you, making the impression of a city you might actually choose. When it fell, there was only the dark and the edge of the sky. We reached the Concho South Fork where it moves like an animal pretending to be lazy. Dust rose and hung. The bridge there had a guardrail that would splinter like cheap furniture if anything asked it to. Cody pulled off before the bridge and let the car idle while he leaned forward over the wheel. The Nova's headlights spread across the grass and made a color that only exists in headlights.
He told us stories he said he had heard from old men who came into the station for chew and talked like the dust in their mouths weighed something.
He said a ranch hand lost his lantern in a flood and came back for it and never came back from coming back. He said a bootlegger fell off his horse and snapped his neck and waved his light until someone picked it up. And when they did, they were the ones stuck waving. He said if you saw a light hanging over the river where there was no road and no boat and no cause, you were supposed to mind your business. We were not built to mind our business. The first sign was not visual. It was a smell that wasn't river or mud or grass. It had a coppery brightness to it, like pennies warmed between fingers, like something meant for inside your skin getting loose. I remember thinking the breeze had turned and brought us the wrong town. Then it came. A circle of white hung like a fruit just above the riverbank, not casting light so much as holding it close. It wasn't a bulb or a flare. It was a kind of patient brightness, a lantern with no handle and no human arm to carry it, the sort of light that stands very still and lets the world choose. The crickets that had been saying their names over and over stopped. The radio clicked without being turned on like it was making an excuse. Cody breathed in through his nose and took his foot off the brake. You think you would be scared in a way that makes sense. You think you would scream and fumble and gun the car backward and curse and pray. What happened to me felt smaller. It was as if some tiny muscle along my spine had made a choice and sent the rest of me the memo. Go. Not even go after it. Not go catch it. Not go anywhere. Just go. The Nova rolled across ruts and weeds, and then we were beyond the beam of our own lights, and so the light on the riverbank became everything. It pulled us without moving. Cody's hands were loose on the wheel, the way they got when he was drunk, only this time he was sober. Raylene had her palms flattened against her thighs, not in fear so much as in patience, like she was waiting her turn for something. We bumped down to where the ground held water, even in August. Mosquitoes came up like smoke. The light slid away from us, and then it didn't. Every time we thought we were getting closer, it moved without rushing. It had the calm of someone who knows every turn of the road better than the road does. I could not tell you how long we chased. Time had the elasticity of a lie you tell yourself to make the minutes behave. The stars burned a hole over us, and the river breathed, and the car's fan clutch sighed at intervals. Once the light went out, and I felt such a dark inside me that I thought I would not make it through the next second. Then it came back, and I believed everything again. We crossed a pasture lined with rusted barbed wire and slid over a cattle guard that clanked hard enough to wake a county. Cody never looked right or left, and I remember thinking he was the best driver I had ever known, because he never asked whether he should be. The light led us up a small rise to a stand of mesquite that had been allowed out of hand. There was a shape there. Not a house exactly, more like the memory of one. A single wall left standing, a fireplace leaning, a concrete square where a porch once had a conversation with sunrises. The light stopped above the concrete, no higher than a man might hold it if he meant to keep his boots out of rattlesnakes. The car idled. The fan clutch sighed. The mosquitoes got what they came for. I have told this next part 2 ways, and I do not know which is true. In one telling, the light drifted toward us right into the path of the headlights, and our beams and its glow overlapped like threads. You could see dust motes swimming in it, and there were shapes inside those dust motes that moved in a way dust does not. In the other telling, the light stayed where it was and something else came forward. The details change when I am alone at night, or when I am driving past a field and something flashes that is only a beer can. Both tellings end the same way. The engine notes changed. A thin whine riding on the normal sound like a note played under a song. The radio hissed and then found a preacher speaking in Spanish, and then the voice tore like paper. Raylene gasped but did not move. Cody whispered her name and she did not look at him. The light was no longer only in front of us. It was across the hood and on the windshield and around our faces. It had a weight. I tasted copper and a kind of sweetness that made my teeth feel like they would float away. Something about the center of it changed. It opened, not a door, more like the shape of a lantern being held by a hand you could not see. And when it opened, what had been held inside it looked straight at us. I cannot prove that. I can tell you that my chest ached the way it does when you jump into cold water, and your heart decides to hit restart. There was a low sound. It might have been wind around the ruined wall. It might have been the long belly of the river. It might have been a voice that had not spoken in 70 years and did not care whether we could hear it as long as we listened. I put my hand on the back of the seat and felt stitches and foam in the precise dirt of Cody's car. I wanted to say we should go back. I wanted to say we had seen enough. I wanted to say I would love them both if they wanted me to. None of that made it out of my mouth. What broke the moment was nothing majestic. A rabbit came loping out from the mesquite with the dumb confidence of night creatures. It ran through the edge of the light and its shadow jumped up the ruin wall and split into two. It startled, jolted left, and the simple life of that animal returned to my body the concept of choice. Cody flinched. Raylene made a sound like a sob and a laugh blended. The light narrowed, or the night thickened, or something adjusted in the world so that we were no longer inside it but only near it. The engine coughed. The car rocked a little, bumped once as if the ground under the front tires had shifted like a chest-drawing breath. Then it was over. If by over you mean we sat in the dark watching nothing while the insects reclaimed their jurisdiction. We got a story out of it that made us both bigger and smaller. On the drive back, nobody turned the radio on. The highway felt like church. Lights appeared where they were supposed to, far off and getting closer at the speed of reason. I remember how the Nova's speedometer needle refused to go above 55 like a promise held. Cody did not talk until we were back in town, and then he began in a slow voice that belonged to someone older, describing the light in ways that made it ordinary. He explained it like heat lightning. He explained it like swamp gas, though we do not have swamps. He explained it like boys explain history when they are trying to fold fear into facts. Raylene nodded and gave him all the softened edges she had to give. I got out at my place off Avenue N where the window unit hummed its complaint and said goodnight like a word that could mean goodbye, if you held it long enough. I did not sleep. I lay awake and watched the slice of parking lot outside my window, and listened to the unit wheeze and imagined the light as a clean, bright coin rolling across the riverbank, as a lantern with nobody to thank for its flame. I remember thinking of graves, of how the dirt settles after a rain, of the way a shovel makes a sound like a cough if you listen. I told myself a person would have to be truly bored or truly desperate to be burying anything in that black land under a moon like the one we had. Then I thought of Cody's hands on the wheel, slack and skillful, and of how sometimes you do not need a reason to dig if the night gives you a tool. In the morning, Casper from the tow company banged on our door because his sister dated my cousin, and because news runs downhill. He said he had a call out to a Nova left chugging in the flats south of town, one of those farm tracks that start confident and end under a mesquite. The car had been found idling with its lights cutting the same section of the earth as if it had been paid to. He said the deputy who called it in needed someone to identify. He said it like a favor and a dare both. I put on jeans and borrowed my dad's belt without asking and got into Casper's wrecker that smelled like stale smoke and old rain. He told me not to borrow money from whichever bank I was thinking about. He told me how radio stations die when you drive too far west. He told me all the words he had for mercy. We got there around 8 after the sun had come up bold and without apology. The Nova sat on a cut of dirt that might once have been a road if you charitably defined road. Its engine still turned, coughing and catching like an old person refusing a nap. The headlights held their own little noon on a patch of ground 20 feet ahead. The deputy, a man named Rosales who had a gentle way of setting his hat on his head like he was asking permission, walked us forward and held his hand up before we reached the headlight's edge. He told us we were going to have a moment of strangeness and then a moment of choice. Casper looked at me like he wanted the first moment to turn into the second without him. The ground in front of the car had been turned over. The dirt loosened in neat, mean cuts, piled to either side in twin banks like two small eskers. The hole was the size men make when they are committing to a plan. It was the right length, the right width, the right depth. The shovel marks were tidy, honest. The clods were damp inside, though the night had been dry. There was a headstone. I use the word stone because I do not have another. It was not limestone or granite. It looked like something poured and set. The shape proper and the surface too smooth, as if it had been waiting beneath and had only needed brushing to come forward. Names were cut there. Even if you tell yourself you will not read them, your eyes are mouths and they eat. They were Cody McCrea and Raylene Ortiz. The dates were there too, the year 1979 twice. carved with the kind of care that says a person practiced or that a hand not human wrote slow to be sure it was copying correctly. I told Deputy Rosales they were my friends, and I did not mean the stone. He nodded and said he was sorry and then told us to step back while he shut off the engine. It took him 3 tries to find the key because hands shake when they do not think anyone is watching. When the engine stopped, the silence that replaced it was a kind that lets other sounds come in by invitation. I could hear a meadowlark, the far-off rush of the highway, the finicky chirp of something under the car's hood as heat settled. The grave ached with its own kind of sound. If you have ever used a shovel, you know it. The memory of metal in earth. I looked at the stone again, and this time I saw something else. Beneath their names, the date for each went on with a hyphen, and a space like a person had started and not finished. Like the end was open for negotiation. Rosales told us he had found the car as it was in the first light and had not seen anyone. He had walked the banks of the river and called until his throat felt like a scraped knee. He told us prints came and went in the soft ground, 3 sets moving and circling the car, and that in some places the prints looked deeper than feet should. He told us he did not need to know what we had been doing, and then told us to tell him anyway because sometimes saying a thing makes the shape of it manageable. I told him about the light, and he did not look at me as if I had handed him a fairy tale. He looked at me like I had told him a weather report. Casper stared at the stone, then at the back seat, then at the stone again. He said he had to get the Nova up on the hook and did not move. We did not fill the hole. We stood around it like people stand around a punchline that did not land. The heat came up and turned our scalp to salt. A county investigator arrived with a thermos and a notepad, and a photographer came with a handkerchief to wipe his lens. They recorded the dirt with the care of librarians. They measured the stone and tapped it and wrote down how it sounded as if their pencils could catch tone. At some point, the idling that had lived in my chest since we arrived shut off, and I realized I had been expecting someone to call out from the mesquite and tell us to quit being melodramatic. No one did. An ant line crossed the pile of dirt in a straight, earnest line committed to their plan. I envied them. By noon we had the car pulled back and loaded. The stone stayed rooted. No one tried to move it. Rosales said he would talk to the county and the county would talk to the state, and someone would make a decision about whether a hole that had work done on it needed to be respected. I went home and took a shower and scrubbed my arms until they were red and watched the water run brown in the tub, like the dirt had followed me. My mother asked if I had eaten and then cooked me eggs that tasted thin. I lay down and dreamed I was a rabbit running into my own shadow and finding there a second rabbit that looked angry to be copied. They found Cody 3 days later at the edge of Lake Nasworthy with his shoes off and his socks still on. He had the look of someone who had been listening a long time, the head turned slightly as if to catch a sentence. There was no violence that anyone could name without swearing to something they did not want to swear to. They found Raylene a week after that under cottonwoods by a fence line west of town where the goat heads stick, even when you walk careful. She had her hands in the dirt as if she were looking for something she dropped. The coroner wrote down words that make doctors nod and families stare at the floor. The paper wrote what it could. People said what they always say when they are arranging facts into something that lets them sleep. I drove out alone after that to where the stone had been. The hole had been filled poorly and then smoothed. The ground a shade darker. The kind of patch the land keeps like a bruise. The stone was gone. Or maybe it was waiting lower, patient. The years sorted themselves the way they do. I left and came back and left again. When I talk about San Angelo to people who do not know it, I talk about the way the sunset can turn the water to a coin none of us will ever spend. I talk about Goodfellow Air Force Base and how planes cut the sky into patterns you cannot memorize. I talk about the heat that makes you kinder because you do not have the energy to be cruel. Sometimes if someone tells a story about a thing they saw in a field that did not belong, I do not tell mine. I take my hands off the wheel and let the car find the center of the lane and breathe through my nose until the copper taste becomes memory. 2 summers ago, I drove out on 208 toward where the land shows you its bones and stopped on a turnoff because my engine made a new sound. While I was waiting for it to decide whether to keep being itself, I walked down off the shoulder and stood at the fence line and watched the wind try to climb through barbs. The sky did the thing it does when it wants to make a person feel unimportant. The smell came before the sight. Not river, not cattle, not dust. That warmed penny smell. That sweetness that says a lantern is being trimmed somewhere and you should not ask who is trimming it. I told myself I would stay where I was. I told myself I would be older than 19 this time. I told myself to mind my business. The light came up from a little fold in the land where water would stand for a day after rain. It hung there. It did not approach. It did not go away. I thought of Cody's hands and of the grave shaped like a plan, and of the names cut with care on a stone that may or may not have ever existed. I thought of the hyphens after the dates and the space waiting. I do not know what would have happened if I had climbed the fence. I do not know what would have happened if I had turned my back. I know what did happen. A truck pulled off behind my car, or maybe it had been there the whole time and I had not noticed because my mind had pinholed. A man got out, a retiree with a hill country cap and a kind face. He asked if I needed help. I said no and thanked him like a person who has been pulled back from a curb. He nodded and then looked past me and shaded his eyes and said the word pretty. He said it like you would say it about a calf being born or a sundown that finally earns its applause. I considered explaining the difference between pretty and what that light was. I did not. I walked back to the car and pretended to check the oil. When I looked again, the light was gone, or maybe the day had made a decision. The man told me a story about his father and about a flood and about a lantern they could not find after, and how his mother had kept a space on the wall where it should have hung because some squares of emptiness deserve respect. If there is a moral, I have not earned it. I have what I saw and what I did not, and I have the feeling of dirt giving underfoot where someone has made a hole and then filled it with what they had. The thing people do not tell you about a grave is that it keeps some of the sound of the shovel forever, and if you stand over it and close your eyes, you can hear it like a heart on a bad night. The last time I let myself go out to the bend where Cody's Nova had idled, the mesquite had thickened and the cattle guard had rusted into a line like an old tattoo. I stood where the headlights had pointed and tried to remember the exact angle and failed. There was a stone again, not where it had been. I do not know if it was the same. It looked poured and set and then brushed clean. The surface too smooth. The edges too sure for something pretending to be accidental. Names there. 2. I told myself I would not read them because not reading has a kind of magic if you are weak. My eyes ate anyway. 1 was mine. The year was carved, and the hyphen waited like a mouth that knows it will be fed. The other name belonged to someone I had not yet met. I did not scream or pray. I did what the body does when given an order by a small muscle along the spine. I stepped back until I felt the ridge of the cattle guard against my heel, and I pivoted and I walked to the car and started it, and I brought the engine's noise up around me like a coat. The radio found a song and then lost it and then found a preacher and then tore. The road back gave me the town in pieces, a billboard for a lawyer. A line of mailboxes leaned like bad teeth, a boat on a trailer with a kid sitting in it eating chips, the river a glint and then a ribbon and then a fact. I parked outside my apartment and did not go in, and watched the slice of parking lot the way you look at a page long after you have stopped reading. When the electric meter clicked, it sounded like a shovel hesitate before the next cut. Somewhere past Knickerbocker, sirens began and ran out their line of sound until they were only a memory, and then a thought and then nothing. Sometimes I wake and smell copper, and I stand in the kitchen with my hands flat on the table like Raylene's on her thighs, and I wait to remember what I am supposed to do. I picture the names carved and the careful dates, and I think about how someone, somewhere, has to make those letters, has to set those hyphens, has to keep the space open. I think maybe the lantern was kindness once, trying to bring men home when the river took them and then it got tired of being kind. Or maybe it was never kind and we are the ones who insist on believing light means good. On certain nights when the wind drops out and the heat stays and everything that is alive holds its breath, the town feels like a paused room, and I feel like the only moving thing in it. I drive then without telling anyone, and I change roads as if I am being followed, and I do not go where the river keeps secrets because the ground there remembers better than I do. The light is not the point. The grave is. The premise was always the same. We are drawn to what names us, to what will hold that name even when our mouths are done. I have learned to be careful with my name, to say it only when necessary and to write it down where the ground cannot see. If the light wants me, it knows me. If the stone is waiting, it has patience. The headlights of 100 cars have pointed at that place since 1979 and will point again. Somewhere in that cone of brightness, the dirt will loosen. Neat, mean, honest, and the space under the hyphen will feel a breath it recognizes and tighten like a hand. The first time I heard the story was on a warm October night in 2005, when Austin still felt like a college town wearing its big city ambitions like an oversized jacket. I was a sophomore then, living in Jester East with a window that looked toward the towers of the downtown skyline, where the cranes were multiplying like metal locusts. Guadalupe Street had that old mix of incense and pizza grease and a trace of book dust from the stores that hadn't yet vanished, and I had just turned 20. My roommate Dylan liked to stand on the drag with a skateboard that he never rode, just leaned against like a badge of authenticity. We were walking back from a Halloween screening at the old Dobie Theater, still a little jittery from some indie horror flick that took place in a forest far from here, when we saw the homeless man on the curb outside the coffee shop. He had a voice like gravel stirred in a paper cup and eyes that were too blue for a face as weathered as his. And he was telling a cluster of costumed freshmen about Shoal Creek. "You want scares," he said, flicking ash from a cigarette he hadn't lit. "You don't need masks and knives. You go to the creek. You go after midnight, west of Lamar, where it slips behind the sycamores and makes its quiet little secrets. You'll meet him if you're blessed or cursed. Man in the white suit. He smiles for you. He always smiles." Some cat-eared freshman girls were giggling, and a tall guy in a fake cowboy hat nudged the man with the toe of a boot that still had a tag dangling from the laces. Dylan snorted. He wasn't a cruel person in general, but give him a crowd and a little adrenaline and he turned into something like a minor league bully. He tapped the man's paper cup with 2 fingers and said, "Tell us a good one, Grandpa. Make it worth the $1." The homeless man looked not at Dylan but at me, and for a second he seemed to see through my college student camouflage, right into the meat of me that was still a shaky kid from a flat little panhandle town who had come to Austin because the maps promised a place where you could walk under trees at 2 in the morning and hear the city breathe. As if I'd asked him politely, he began. "Flood took him," he said, "years back. Halloween are close enough. Creek runs low most of the time, but when it comes quick. You know the wall off 28th. You know the footbridge near Pease Park. Water can jump that in 15 minutes with the right sky. You think you're standing on dry rock and then you're in it." He was dressed up fancy as a wedding, white suit that glowed in the lightning, walking along the bank with a girl who had a red scarf and a laugh you could hear over the thunder. The water got them both. Took her first and then him. The creek kept his face, gave it back smooth. Porcelain like a doll, but he smiles like he knows your name already, like he's been waiting his whole dead year for you. One of the cat-eared girls said gross, but she was leaning in. I watched the homeless man's fingers worry the soft rim of the cup and noticed that his nails looked polished. Not clean, but buffed the way rocks in a river get shiny over time. He lifted his cigarette to his lips and inhaled nothing. Dylan produced $1 with theatrical reluctance and dropped it into the cup. I dug out 2 quarters and followed. The cat-eared girls drifted away. The guy in the cowboy hat asked where the house parties were and then followed them. Dylan laughed and clapped the man on the shoulder. The old guy flinched, then turned his head toward the sound of Shoal Creek like he was listening for something only he could hear. Back in the dorm, the hall smelled like ramen and damp towels. Dylan fell onto his bed and started mapping out a Halloween route that involved 3 parties and a 4th if we had time. I sat on the sill with my knees against the glass and watched the lights on Mopac move like strings of beads. Somewhere below, a siren rose and fell and rose again. I thought about the girl with the red scarf and a laugh that carried over thunder. It felt like a scene from an old Austin legend, one of those stories people tell to seem local. But there was a detail to it that made my skin tighten, like maybe the man didn't get it from a pamphlet. We had an exam on Monday. I had 4 unpaid parking tickets. There were a dozen reasons not to go looking for ghosts, and I intended to listen to all of them. I fell asleep with my cheek against the cool window and dreamed of a white shape walking along a black ribbon of water. Halloween was a Monday that year, which meant most of the parties were on Saturday, but the city still had a way of saving its strange energy for the actual night. The air was warm after sundown, the kind of soft heat you can only get in Texas, and the oaks along Speedway held their leaves in a way that made the streetlights look like lanterns swinging in slow motion. I had a lab in the evening and came out into a dusk that smelled like wet concrete and fried dough. Dylan wanted to hit West Campus for a late drink, then loop back by the creek for a dare. He called it a victory lap. He had a vampire cape in his backpack, and I had a hockey mask in mine, neither of which made any sense unless you were 19. We cut down to Lamar and swung west toward Peace Park, past houses where pumpkins grinned with jagged teeth and a single lawn inflatable ghost leaned to one side like it was tired of the show. There were people out walking dogs in little costumes, families moving in clusters, a few older folks on their porches with bowls of candy and looks of patient amusement. The closer we got to the creek, the thinner the traffic became. The park lights threw long bars across the dirt, and somewhere nearby a basketball thumped. Shoal Creek itself was mostly a whisper, a slick of dark water sliding around pale stones. Standing on the footbridge, you could hear it talking if you wanted to, the voice of water in a concrete throat, patient and tireless. Dylan leaned over the railing and said, "Hey, man in the white suit, we brought company," in the loud whisper he used for all jokes after 10 o'clock. He put on the vampire cape and flared it like a magician, then laughed at his own reflection. A gust of wind moved the oak leaves and touched the back of my neck with the damp breath of the creek. I wanted to make fun of the legend, but the words curdled in my mouth and I swallowed them. A couple in cat costumes came over the bridge holding hands. The girl was unsteady on her heels, and her boyfriend, or the guy playing that role for the night, had 3 plastic fangs on his lower lip. They paused, looked at us, and decided we were harmless. When they were gone, we were alone on the bridge with the water and the trees and the low rumble of cars on Mopac that sounded like a giant rolling over in its sleep. "Okay, this is boring," Dylan said. "Let's grab tacos." We left the footbridge and followed the path that shadowed the creek for a while. There were places where the city fell away, and you could almost forget that Guadalupe was only a few blocks east. Live oak, cypress, a litter of pale stones. In one bend, the creek widened into a shallow pool that held the sky like a mirror broken into pieces. I stood on the bank and watched the leaves gather and turn on their own axes in the eddy. Dylan skipped a rock and it jumped 3 times before sinking with a sound like a sigh. He bowed as if to acknowledge his audience, an audience of 1. Then a new sound joined the night, soft as a hand brushing cloth. Footsteps, I thought, but not quite right. The rhythm was human and not. A measured slide that picked up grit and let it fall. It came from downstream in the darkness where the trees overhung the water and a wooden fence leaned like a shrug. I felt a familiar tug of panic, the childhood fear of being caught out after curfew, and it made me mad. I told myself it was some drunk making his way home by the path instead of the street, then told myself that drunk people were still people and probably harmless. I put a hand on Dylan's arm. He shrugged it off, then saw my face and turned to look. What I remember clearest are the shoes, white as if they had been dipped in paint, stepping neatly from rock to rock. Above them, white trousers with a knife crease that caught the meager light and bent it upward. Then the jacket, also white, smooth across the shoulders and fitted in a way that looked old-fashioned without being a costume, like something from a photograph. He stepped into the shallow pool and the water lapped at the leather without leaving a mark. I could not see his face yet. I'm embarrassed to say that a part of me thought it might be a prank. The city did that to you. It made you mistrust the strange by training you to expect a punchline. Dylan whispered an obscenity and then, of course, said hello. The man in the white suit did not answer. He moved to the center of the creek and stood there with the water around his shins, hands at his sides. When he lifted his head, the light from a passing car dragged enough brightness through the trees to give us a look. I was right about the smoothness. It wasn't a mask, or if it was, it fit better than any rubber you could buy on the drag. The face was hairless and glossy without pores, with a nose that was barely a suggestion and cheekbones that seemed to have been drawn in with a single line. The eyes were shut. That is the part I always forget to tell at first because what comes next overwhelms it. But he was standing in the water with his eyes closed, like a man waiting for his turn to be baptized. Then he smiled. It was not grotesque. It was not too wide or filled with needles or dripping anything you wouldn't want to look at. It was a neat, agreeable smile, the smile of a man who does not need to hide his teeth to be polite. It was worse than a mouthful of knives. It was friendly. It said, "I know you." It said, "I am glad you finally came." Dylan laughed and yelled something about late-night fashion shows. He picked up a pebble, then thought better of it and let it fall back to the path. I took a step forward, without knowing I was doing it, drawn by the same gravity that makes you lean toward the edge when you're high up. The man lifted his hand, palm open. His skin caught the dim light and held it in a way that made me think of enamel. Somewhere above us, a branch scraped another branch with a dry squeal. The creak hissed over stone. "Sir?" Dylan said. The word tilted with that mix of mockery and nervousness that defines most male college conversation. "Nice costume." The man's smile stayed exactly the same. His lips did not recover or reset. They were simply in that shape and expected you to meet them there. He lowered his hand and moved toward the bank without splashing. When he reached the edge, he stepped up onto the dirt and the water slid off the white shoes like shimmering dust, leaving no stain. He turned his head and seemed to focus on Dylan for a fraction too long, the way a blind person might orient toward a voice. There was a hairline crack at the corner of his mouth, only an inch or two, as if the porcelain had been flexed too many times in the same place. Without changing his expression, he angled his body to face me. "Okay," Dylan said, voice brighter than the air. "Okay, man, we'll get out of your creek." We backed away along the path, not running because running would make us children, and neither of us wanted to be that. The man did not follow immediately. He stood in his whiteness under the trees and tilted his head so slightly that you might have missed it if you were not watching the way I was, with the hyper-focus that comes when you realize you were wrong about how the world works. When he did move, it was to turn in a steady half-circle as if lining up with an invisible guide. Then he walked the path we had just taken, not fast, not slow, exactly our speed. We crossed Lamar with a sudden thrill of relief for the ordinary danger of traffic. The cars did their car things. The man in the white suit stepped off the curb into the street without breaking pace, and the first car passed through him. It looked like heat haze, a mirage ripple, but the driver didn't honk, didn't brake, didn't do anything because nothing had happened except in the part of reality that Dylan and I were occupying. We ran after that because we were finally allowed to. We didn't stop until the yellow bulk of Jester rose in front of us like a ship, and the cold electric glow of the lobby poured out onto the plaza. Students in cheap costumes flowed around us. Someone in a giant hot dog suit flapped past. We pushed into the elevator with two other people, both of whom smelled like beer and perfume and safety. On our floor, the hall was loud with music. Dylan fumblingly jammed the key into the lock. Inside, our little room was an island of dirty socks and open textbooks. We stood there looking at each other. He said, "Dude?" I said, "I know." He said it again. I said nothing. I went to the window. Our room looked southeast across the campus, not directly toward the creek, but the city reflects upon itself. I put my palm against the glass and felt the radiating cool. On the desk behind me, my phone buzzed with some automated reminder about a library book. Dylan turned on the TV and flipped through channels that were either football or old movies. The sound washed the edges off my thoughts, and for a while that felt like enough. I told myself we had seen an elaborate prank. Someone had a budget and a sense of theater. Maybe it was a film student. Maybe it was an art project. The part with the car was a trick of the eye. The brain lies to you all the time. I repeated these ideas in different orders until they sounded close enough to true. When I looked out again, I saw him. The dorm had a checkerboard of windows, some lit, some dark, some glowing with strings of novelty lights or the blue square of a television. In one of the dark squares across the narrow courtyard, there was the suggestion of white. Not a person, not even a silhouette. A seam of brightness where nothing should be. I leaned closer until the glass cooled my breath. The seam widened with a patient shrug, opening like a smile. A face slid into the frame, pale, smooth, perfect in the way that nothing human is perfect, and turned until it was looking straight into our room. The lips were already shaped, and when they stretched a fraction more, the crack at the corner opened like a paper cut. The mouth remained closed. The smile deepened. The eyes stayed shut. I learned something about myself then. I learned that even in the age of cell phones and smug certainty, I could go back to the oldest rituals. I covered my mouth with my hand. Dylan, who had been mid-sentence about something that did not matter, followed my gaze and froze. His voice quit on a syllable. He took 2 hopeful steps forward and then 1 backward. The TV made cheerful noises from a stadium far away. The white face held steady across the courtyard, its attention like a weight. I said, "He followed us." Dylan said, "No." The word had 2 syllables now, the first a denial, the second a prayer. He picked up the remote and pointed it at the window as if it would change the channel on reality. The face tilted, once, and in the tilt I read something like amusement. Then it turned away and took the rest of the body with it. A simple motion. A man stepping back from a window to attend to other things. The dark square swallowed the light. We argued. Of course we did. Arguments are bridges back to normal. Dylan accused me of suggesting we go to the creek. I reminded him that it was his idea. We both agreed not to tell anyone because no one would believe it. He said he would believe it if someone else told him. A sentence that made sense until you listened to it. He pulled his desk chair against the door and sat facing it, as if the threat would knock before entering. I left the blinds open. I could not bring myself to pretend there was nothing to see. Around 2 in the morning, the hall settled. Footsteps faded. Someone on our floor sang 3 lines of a song and then forgot the words. I sat on the bed with my back against the cinder block wall and tried to feel like a collegiate adult. Tried to be the rational voice, and failed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw a white corridor and a smile that did not change. I got up to brush my teeth and flinched at my own reflection. I rinsed the sink twice to chase away the irrational idea that the water was moving too slowly. When I came back, Dylan was asleep in the chair, head tilted, mouth open. The courage of the watcher had lost to the human requirement of rest. I considered waking him and then decided sleep was an act of mercy. I turned off the TV and the room unclenched. The glow of the city rested soft on the walls. I stood again at the window and looked where the face had been. There was nothing there but a row of dark squares and a sense that something had been left behind like a scent. I stared into that darkness the way you stare into a night sky. The more you look, the more you see until you start to build constellations from your own nerves. I didn't hear him so much as feel the air admit his presence. When I looked, he was 3 floors down, standing under the sodium light that made his suit look like bone. The courtyard was empty except for him. He did not move his head, but the chin nudged upward until our sight lines met. He raised his hand again, that cracked porcelain hand, and pinched his fingers together as if taking hold of a thread. Then, he pulled gently, hand to chest, a fisherman convinced he had a bite. The gesture was slow enough that I could tell myself it was not meant for me. Slow enough that I could fail to believe. I took 1 step back from the glass. He stopped, and the smile, impossibly, grew pleased. I put my palm to the window again, angry at myself for being a participant in a game I didn't understand. He lowered his hand and mimed the motion back at me, palm to the air in front of his face, an echo of my touch. My heart made a complicated leap inside my chest. I told myself, very clearly, that I would close the blinds. I did not move. He began to walk along the courtyard toward the door that led to our stairwell. His shoes left no mark on the concrete. A group of students came out of another building laughing and passed through him without knowing. One of them shivered, as if his body remembered winter for a moment, and then laughed again, unaware. The man in the white suit put his hand to the door, and the door considered its options and decided to open. He stepped into the stairwell, and the building's ordinary noise swallowed him. I woke Dylan with a word. We listened to the stairwell's muffled silence together. Somewhere far below, a door thunked. A vending machine made its dying wail hum. There was no footfall, no echo. I had the idiotic thought that perhaps he would knock. The knock of a polite visitor, something we could refuse. The knob moved. We had no chain lock. We had a chair against it and 2 boys who would testify that a chair was a meaningful barrier. The knob turned against the wood, met the chair's short metal leg, and stopped. It relaxed. It turned again. Dylan jumped up and braced his hands on the back of the chair. I put my head close to the door and listened. The paint smelled like institutional cleaner and old anxiety. The knob went very still. When the knock came, it was gentle. 3 quiet taps spaced like a heartbeat. Dylan shook his head. I shook mine. The second set of taps came with the same courtesy, as if the visitor did not wish to intrude. Dylan whispered, "He can't come in if we don't let him." And I wanted to believe that we were still working within a rule book, one of those old vampire codes that give you power through faith. I kept my mouth shut because my mouth had never gotten me out of anything in my life. The third knock did not come. Instead, the door itself gave a small sound, a dry sigh, and bowed inward the width of a hand. The chair leg screeched, and then the bow relaxed, and the door resumed its proper shape. The chair stood where it had been. The knob was innocent. We did not sleep. The sky went from black to violet to pearl. Morning made its own set of lies, and for a few hours we accepted them. Dylan showered and insisted he had a class he could not miss. I stayed in the room and watched people drift through their day. I told myself the white suit was a trick of exhaustion, and that adrenaline had collaborated with the city's shiny edges to give me a story. That afternoon, I went to the library and sat not reading in a patch of sun. The campus felt like 1,000 radios tuned to almost the same station. The air smelled like cedar and concrete and coffee. My hands shook for no good reason. When I returned to the dorm, the chair was no longer against the door. Dylan was gone. His desk held a pile of flyers for parties yet to come. The blinds were open. I could end the story there. Let it be the tale of two boys in a shared hallucination, but endings are honest when they trouble you. I lasted through another night by pretending to be the kind of person who did not get followed. I did not look out the window. I did not look into mirrors longer than required. I avoided water deeper than a sink. I attended my classes and nodded at the appropriate moments. My friends asked where Dylan was, and I said he had taken off for San Marcos with a girl, which was the kind of lie that made people smile and accept that you were not asking for help. On the second night, close to midnight, the dorm fire alarm went off. Someone burned popcorn. The hallway filled with sleepy anger and bare feet. I went down the stairs with everyone else, grateful for the crowd, grateful for the light. We gathered in the courtyard, shivering though the night was still warm, complaining in the way that made you feel like a citizen. A campus police car idled by the curb, lights spinning lazily. I was thinking of nothing in particular when I saw him just beyond the circle of our collective safety, the white suit quietly bright. He stood with his hands in his pockets like any man waiting for the show to end. He turned his head toward me and smiled, and though the mouth did not open, I understood that he was speaking. Not words, directions. He had been speaking all along, and I had mistaken it for silence. I did not go to him. I approached the officer and opened my mouth to say something sensible, something about a man who did not belong here. The words I produced were incomparable, the vocabulary of dreams. The officer nodded in the way people nod to get you to step back from their car. The alarm stopped. The crowd began to dissolve. When I looked again, the white suit was gone. My fellow students drifted upstairs in streams, unaware that the current had shifted. Around 2, I finally lay down. The dorm hum became a blanket. The city murmured its usual lullabies. I let sleep come because you have to if you want to survive. And somewhere between a breath and a heartbeat, I woke to the sense that I was not alone. He was at the foot of my bed. He did not loom or gesture or make a single theatrical move. He stood like a man on an elevator watching the numbers rise. Patient because patience is all he has. The smile was in place, and now I could see what sat behind it. Not teeth, not even a mouth in the way that we use the word, an interior brightness that wanted out. At the corner, the hairline crack had widened, as if the porcelain face had been warmed by breath. I understood then that the face was a courtesy, a civic consideration he put on to keep from blinding us. The smile was a seam in an envelope. The white suit was not a suit, not really. It was a limit, a boundary we could recognize the way a riverbank makes water legible. Please, I said, unsure what I was asking for. Dylan snored once in the chair, and the sound broke like a wave against the moment and was gone. The man tilted his head toward my roommate and then back to me. You, the tilt said. You because you listened. He reached into his jacket slowly, carefully, as if to show me nothing bad was coming, and withdrew something small and red. For a second my brain refused to name it. Then it clicked into place with the sick certainty of a lock. A scarf, neatly folded, the color of a stoplight, and a tongue and a wound. He laid it across the back of the chair where Dylan's head rested and smoothed the fabric with the side of his hand. Dylan did not stir. The scarf curled on itself like a sleeping animal. I shook my head and said no, and the words sounded like water going over a stone. The man in the white suit touched 2 fingers to the place on his smooth knot face where a cheek might be. It was a kindly gesture. It made me cry. He turned, walked to the window, and put his hand to the glass. The pain clouded around his fingers as if tested by breath. Then it yielded, not with a crack or a crunch or any violent announcement. It opened like soft clay. He stepped into it and threw it and out onto the air of the courtyard. And for a second he was standing on nothing and everything at once, and then he was gone, and the glass remembered how to be glass. In the morning, Dylan was not in the chair. His bed was made. His backpack was gone. The red scarf lay folded on the desk with a note under it in my handwriting that I did not write. It said, "Come down to the water." The letters looked ordinary and steady, as if I had taken my time. The campus police listened to me for as long as the clock allowed and then told me that college kids take breaks sometimes and that I should talk to the dean if he didn't come back in a few days. I called his parents and lied for as long as I could, and then started telling the truth and felt them hate me for not finding a truer one. I walked to the creek that afternoon. The sky was thin blue. The rocks looked like bones. At the footbridge, I saw a shoe print in the dust of the path, sharp and clean, pointed toward the water. It was as white as if pressed by chalk. I followed the bank until I found the shallow pool and stood there until the shadows lengthened. I practiced breathing. I practiced being the kind of person who does not call out to the dead. I did not put on the scarf. I did not step into the water. When I finally turned back toward campus, the city was already collecting the day and storing it as history. I passed people carrying pumpkins and groceries and laundry. I passed a man on the drag who might have been the storyteller and might have been someone else wearing that face. He lifted his cigarette to lips that had forgotten smoke and said in a voice like gravel in a paper cup that the creek keeps what it wants until the night comes when it doesn't. That night I moved the chair against the door, then moved it away. I closed the blinds, then opened them because I could not stand a barrier whose power I did not believe in. I lay down without turning off the light and willed myself to be boring, uninviting, hollow. The city breathed. A siren went by without urgency. Somewhere in the building, a microwave dinged. I fell asleep the way you fall through thin ice. I have not seen the man in the white suit since then, not with my waking eyes. Every Halloween, I feel a pressure change in the air and I stay indoors and I talk too much and I keep my hands busy. People still vanish in a city this size for reasons that have nothing to do with anything you can name. And I understand the generous safety of believing every disappearance is a bad decision and a bus ticket. When I pass Shoal Creek, I walk a little faster. I think about the courtesy of porcelain, the mercy of a wardrobe, and the way the water speaks without raising its voice. I think about a laugh that could carry over thunder, and what it means to wear a color you are not strong enough to hold. Years later, when the dorms had new names and the book dust along the drag had thinned, and the cranes were the permanent new birds of the skyline, a student I didn't know sat next to me on a bus heading north on Lamar and told his friend about a thing he saw by the creek. He was laughing to make it safe. His laugh made my hands sweat. He said it looked at him and smiled like it knew his name already. He said he wanted to go back and film it for a class. The friend said he was an idiot. The bus turned, the driver humming. The city watched itself pass in the glass. I did not say a word because warnings are only useful to people who want to hear them, and because I had learned that stories are invitations, and because somewhere down in the concrete throat of that creek, a patient voice was counting, and because I do not know what it means that when I dream of the windows of that dorm, I see my own room lit, and a man in a white suit standing on the air outside, face silver smooth, eyes closed, smiling, and that when I wake I'm smiling too, just a little in exactly the same way.